Tonight, we are embarking on a journey through the shadows of the human experience, spanning across 5 different corners of our world. We will travel from the neon-drenched streets of Columbus, Ohio, to the jagged, frost-bitten ridges of the Yuba County Mountains in California. We will venture south to the mysterious, mist-covered hills of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and across the Pacific to the bustling, high-stakes urban sprawl of Osaka, Japan. Finally, we will step back in time to the eerie, silent isolation of a farmstead in Bavaria, Germany. In each of these places, the ordinary world collided with something inexplicable. We will encounter disappearances that defy the laws of physics, crimes that seem to have been orchestrated by ghosts, and mysteries that have left investigators staring into a void for decades. These are stories of people who woke up expecting a normal day, only to find themselves stepping into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Our first story takes us to the heart of a bustling college town on a vibrant spring night in the year 2006. It is a story about a young man with a brilliant future who walked through a single, monitored door into a crowded room and was never seen again. The air in Columbus, Ohio, on the night of March 31st, 2006, carried that specific, heavy dampness that follows a lukewarm spring rain. It was a Friday evening, the kind of night where the collective tension of the work week usually evaporates into the sounds of laughter, the rhythmic thumping of bass from passing cars, and the rhythmic clinking of glassware. For 27-year-old Brian Schaefer, this wasn't just another Friday. This was a threshold. It was the official beginning of spring break, a desperately needed reprieve from the grueling, soul-crushing schedule of a second-year medical student at The Ohio State University. Brian was the kind of person people were naturally drawn to. He possessed a bright, easy smile and a tall, athletic build that suggested a life defined by health and vitality. He had a shock of dark hair and a way of looking at people that made them feel like they were the only person in the room. But if you looked closer, past the charismatic exterior and the white coat ambition, you would see the faint, lingering shadows of a profound and recent grief. Just 3 weeks prior to this night, Brian had lost his mother, Renee, to a sudden and devastating battle with cancer. She had been his rock, his confidant, the person who understood his drive better than anyone else. Her passing had been a jagged tear in the fabric of his life, a wound that was nowhere near healing. He was trying to stitch himself back together with the help of his long-term girlfriend, Alexis, and the familiar, exhausting rhythm of his medical studies. Earlier that evening, the sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long orange shadows across the city. Brian sat down for a celebratory dinner with his father, Randy Schaefer. They chose a local steakhouse where the air was thick with the rich, savory scent of seared meat and the low, comforting hum of adult conversation. Randy looked across the table at his son, noticing the deep fatigue etched into the corners of Brian's eyes, but he also saw a spark of something else, a desire to just feel normal, if only for a few hours. They talked about the future, about Brian's upcoming trip to Miami with Alexis, scheduled for the very next Monday. Many in their inner circle believed that this trip was the one that Brian was finally going to ask Alexis to marry him on the white sands of the Florida coast. When the dinner ended, Brian stood up and hugged his father. The warmth of the embrace was a silent acknowledgement of their shared loss, a bridge between two men trying to navigate a world without Renee. Brian told his father he loved him, a simple phrase that would later echo in Randy's mind for years. As Brian walked away toward his car, he looked like any other young man stepping out from under a dark cloud, heading toward a night of freedom. By 10 o'clock that night, the atmosphere had shifted from the quiet dignity of a steakhouse to the electric, frantic energy of the University District. Brian met up with his close friend, William Clint Florence, at a spot that was a staple for the local college crowd, the Ugly Tuna Saloona. To get inside the Ugly Tuna, you didn't just walk through a door on the street. You had to ascend a long, silver escalator that rose from the pavement like a slow-moving metallic tongue, delivering patrons into a second-story world of loud music and dim, neon-soaked lighting. The air inside the bar was a heady, suffocating mix of spilled beer, cheap cologne, and the raw energy of hundreds of students looking to forget their responsibilities. Brian stood near the edge of the bar, the neon blue lights reflecting off the lenses of his glasses. He was dressed casually, an olive green button-down shirt over a white long-sleeve tee, jeans, and well-worn sneakers. He looked exactly like everyone else in the room. This was the illusion of normalcy. To anyone watching, Brian was just another face in the sea of youth, a young doctor-to-be enjoying a well-earned drink. But while the crowd saw a friend and a scholar, the environment itself was beginning to feel like a meticulously crafted trap. The Ugly Tuna was packed to capacity. The music, a loud, thumping mix of early 2000s rock and pop, made conversation nearly impossible without shouting directly into someone's ear. The shadows in the corners of the bar were deep and deceptive, and the movement of the crowd was a chaotic, shifting tide of bodies. In the corner of the room, perched high above the entrance where the escalator met the landing, sat a single security camera. Its unblinking digital eye panned slowly back and forth, recording the steady stream of people entering and exiting. It was the silent guardian of the establishment, the digital witness to every person who crossed that threshold. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Brian and Clint were joined by another friend, Meredith Reed. The trio began a bar crawl, moving from the Ugly Tuna to several other spots in the area. They did shots of tequila, they toasted to the end of exams, and they laughed until their lungs ached. They were young, they were successful, and they were invincible. But eventually, like a moth drawn back to a specific flame, Brian insisted they return to the Ugly Tuna Saloona for one last round before the night ended. They arrived back at the top of the escalator just before 2 o'clock in the morning. The security camera caught them clear as day. Brian was seen leaning against the metal railing just outside the entrance, talking to 2 young women. He was laughing, gesturing with his hands, seemingly without a single care in the world. He appeared relaxed, his body language open and friendly. He waved goodbye to the women, turned back toward the double doors of the bar, and stepped inside, disappearing into the dense, churning crowd of the Ugly Tuna once more. At that moment, the bar was at its peak of chaos as the last call approached. The predator in this story wasn't necessarily a man in a dark coat or a figure lurking in an alleyway. The predator was the sheer, overwhelming anonymity of a crowd of hundreds of people. To those around him, Brian was just a blur of olive green moving through the dark. To the cameras, he was now a ghost. Inside that bar, amongst the smell of sweat and the deafening roar of the music, the clock began to wind down on the life Brian Schaefer knew. He was in a room with only one viable public exit, surrounded by friends under the watchful eye of a camera. And yet, the stage was being set for a disappearance that would defy every law of logic. The digital clock on the security feed flickered, the pale white numbers changing with a cold, rhythmic precision. It was 1:55 in the morning. Inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the atmosphere had reached a fever pitch. This was the witching hour of the college bar scene, that frantic, desperate window of time where the music seems to double in volume and the crowd becomes a singular, heaving organism. The scent of spilled bourbon and heavy perfume was cloying, almost thick enough to taste. Brian Schaefer, having just finished his brief conversation with the 2 young women outside, turned his back to the camera and stepped back through the heavy double doors. He moved with a casual gait, his olive green shirt disappearing into the shadows of the foyer before he fully re-entered the main room. To the security camera, this was just another routine motion, a body moving from light into darkness. But in the grand, terrifying tapestry of this mystery, this was the exact moment the trap snapped shut. Brian Schaefer had just stepped out of the visible world and into a void that no one, not even the most seasoned investigators, would ever be able to see through. Inside, the initial chaos was beginning to unfold. The last call announcement had been made, and the bar staff were already shifting their energy from service to clearance. The bright, unforgiving house lights began to flicker on, cutting through the moody neon blue and revealing the ugly side of the Ugly Tuna, the wet rings on the wooden tables, the discarded napkins, the weary faces of people who had stayed just a little too long. Clint Florence and Meredith Reed stood near the center of the room, jostled by the outgoing tide of patrons. They looked around, their eyes scanning the thinning crowd for Brian's familiar tall frame and his olive green shirt. They expected to see him coming back from the bathroom or perhaps finishing a final conversation near the back of the bar. But as the minutes ticked toward 2 o'clock in the morning, the space began to feel uncomfortably empty. "Have you seen Brian?" Clint asked, his voice strained over the dying embers of the music. Meredith shook her head, her eyes darting toward the exit. "I thought he was right behind us." They decided to wait by the top of the escalator, the only logical exit for anyone leaving the establishment. They stood there as the silver serrated steps groaned and hummed, carrying a steady stream of laughing, stumbling people down toward the street level. They watched every face. They saw groups of students leaning on each other for support, couples arguing in low, hushed tones, and lone individuals staring blankly at their phones. But they did not see Brian. At 2 o'clock, the security guards began the final sweep. The music died completely, replaced by the jarring sound of chairs being dragged across the floor and the clinking of empty bottles being tossed into plastic bins. The air, once vibrant and electric, was now stagnant. Clint and Meredith were eventually ushered toward the escalator themselves. They stood on the moving metal stairs, descending slowly toward the sidewalk, their eyes still fixed on the landing above, hoping to see Brian run out at the last second, shouting an apology for making them wait. The sidewalk outside was a chaotic scene of its own. Cabs honked their horns, people shouted for their friends, and the cold Ohio air bit at any exposed skin. Clint pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glowed a harsh, artificial blue in the darkness. He scrolled to Brian's name and hit call. He held the phone to his ear, listening. Ring, 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 ring. The sound was hollow, a rhythmic electronic pulse that seemed to vibrate into the empty night. It didn't go to voicemail immediately, which meant the phone was still on, still searching for a signal, still sitting in a pocket or on a table somewhere within earshot, but there was no answer. They waited for nearly 45 minutes. They paced the sidewalk in front of the building, checking the nearby shadows and looking into the windows of the shuttered shops. They assumed, with the typical logic of a late night out, that Brian must have simply slipped out through the crowd without them seeing him. Perhaps he had grown tired of the noise and decided to walk back to his apartment, which was only a short distance away. Maybe he had met someone else and left through a side door they didn't know about. But as the street began to quiet and the last of the crowds dispersed into the surrounding neighborhoods, a heavy, cold realization began to settle in Clint's stomach. It wasn't an alarm yet, but it was a nagging, discordant note. Brian wasn't the type to just vanish without a word, especially not with their planned trip to Miami looming just 48 hours away. The initial chaos of the bar's closing had provided the perfect cover for whatever had happened. In those final 15 minutes, the Ugly Tuna had been a labyrinth of movement. There was a service door toward the back, usually reserved for staff, that led out toward a construction site where a new section of the building was being erected. This area was a skeletal maze of raw timber, exposed wiring, and jagged concrete, a place where the shadows were deeper and the footing was treacherous. As the sun began to peek over the horizon on Saturday morning, casting a pale gray light over Columbus, Brian's apartment remained silent. His car sat untouched in its parking spot. His cell phone continued to ring into the void, its battery slowly draining as it broadcasted a signal from a location that remained stubbornly invisible. The world was waking up to a beautiful spring weekend, but for Brian Schaefer, the sudden incident had already concluded. He had walked into a room full of people, under the watchful eye of a digital guardian, and he had simply ceased to be. The silence that followed was not just a lack of sound, it was a physical weight. It was the sound of a life being paused in mid-sentence. And as the hours turned into days, that silence would grow into a deafening roar that would haunt the city of Columbus for decades to come. If there was a predator in the shadows of the Ugly Tuna Saloon that night, they possessed a chilling, instinctive understanding of the environment's most fatal flaws. To understand the dark side of this mystery, one must look past the neon signs and the polished wood of the bar and stare directly into the skeletal remains of the building's expansion. Directly adjacent to the main floor, separated only by a temporary wall and a single heavy service door, was a construction site that resembled a geometric nightmare. Imagine a space where the ceiling is a tangle of exposed, yellowed insulation and silver ductwork that hums with a low, industrial vibration. The floor was not the smooth, dark wood of the bar, but a treacherous expanse of uneven, raw concrete and thick, black mud. Piles of drywall dust coated every surface like a fine, ghostly powder, deadening the sound of footsteps and catching the faint, flickering light from the street lamps outside. This was a place of meticulous preparation, not necessarily by a person, but by the very nature of urban development. A predator, whether a person with dark intent or the environment itself, would find this the perfect soundproof system. While hundreds of people laughed and shouted just 20 feet away, the construction zone was a tomb of silence. Any struggle, any muffled cry, any heavy thud would have been swallowed whole by the thick layers of insulation and the sheer, overwhelming volume of the music thumping through the walls. The psychology of a killer in such a space is one of opportunistic genius. They would have seen the mask of the bar, the chaos, the alcohol-induced blurred vision of the patrons, and the singular focus of the security camera on the main entrance. They would have known that the service door was often left unlocked or propped open by staff seeking a breath of air. This was the gap in the armor. In the mind of a predator, Brian Schaefer wasn't just a medical student. He was a target of convenience in a world of blind spots. If someone had lured Brian into that dark, unfinished wing of the building, they would have had access to a labyrinth of deep, open pits intended for plumbing and structural supports. These were dark, vertical voids that reached down into the very foundation of the earth. Some whispered in the years that followed about the terrifying possibility of wet concrete, the idea that a body could be discarded into a foundation and sealed forever beneath the weight of a city, a permanent part of the architecture. There is a cold, calculated horror in the thought of someone watching Brian that night. Someone who noticed his height, his olive green shirt that blended so easily into the shadows, and his solitary moment of separation from his friends. This hypothetical predator didn't need a secret basement or a complex kidnapping kit. They had the construction site, a ready-made chamber of horrors where the meticulous preparation had already been done by the builders. Every wire hanging from the ceiling, every jagged piece of rebar protruding from the floor like a rusted finger, and every shadow cast by the stacks of timber served a dark purpose. It was a landscape designed for disappearance. And as the city of Columbus slept, the dark side of the ugly Tuna Saloona remained a silent witness to a transition that should have been impossible. The vibrant, ambitious life of Brian Schaefer had been pulled into a world of gray dust and cold stone, where the laws of the surface world no longer applied. The morning of April 1st, 2006, arrived with a deceptive clarity. While the rest of the world engaged in the light-hearted trickery of April Fool's Day, a chillingly real vanishing act was unfolding in the University District of Columbus. When Brian Schaefer failed to show up at his apartment that morning, and then failed to answer the dozens of increasingly frantic calls from his girlfriend Alexis, the police deadlock began to take its agonizing shape. The initial response was a slow-motion collision of bureaucracy and disbelief. At first, there was the standard operating procedure, the assumption that a 27-year-old man had simply overextended his Friday night celebrations. But by Sunday, when Brian's car remained parked in its designated spot, and his suitcase for the Miami trip sat zipped and waiting by his bed, the Columbus Police Department realized they weren't dealing with a hungover student. They were looking for a ghost. Detectives descended upon the ugly Tuna Saloona like a swarm of gray-suited hornets. The air inside the bar, now stripped of its nighttime glamour, smelled of industrial floor cleaner and the sour ghost of spilled beer. They headed straight for the small, cramped office where the surveillance system's hard drive hummed in the corner. For hours, they sat in the flickering glow of the monitors, their eyes straining against the grainy, low-resolution footage from that Friday night. They watched the last call rush. They watched hundreds of people, literally hundreds, stream out of those double doors and down the silver escalator. They saw Clint and Meredith waiting. They saw the two women Brian had been talking to. And then, they found him. At 1:55 in the morning, there was Brian Schaefer, unmistakable in his olive green shirt, walking toward the entrance. He stepped inside. The detectives leaned closer to the screen. They waited. They fast-forwarded. They rewound. They watched every single person who exited that bar until the very last employee turned off the lights and locked the doors. Brian Schaefer never came back out. This was the social and psychological barrier that would paralyze the investigation. The camera didn't blink. It didn't glitch. It recorded a physical impossibility. The detectives were forced to grapple with a reality that defied the laws of the physical world. It was as if the ugly Tuna Saloona was a carnivorous organism that had swallowed a man whole and left no trace of the meal. The search efforts that followed were massive, yet they were plagued by the minor errors that often haunt a cold case. Search dogs were brought in, bloodhounds with long, drooping ears and wet noses that could pick up a scent from days prior. They were given a pair of Brian's worn sneakers to sniff. The dogs barked and lunged, leading the handlers through the bar and directly to that heavy service door leading to the construction site. But once they crossed the threshold into the world of raw plywood and drywall dust, the trail went cold. The scent simply vanished, as if Brian had stepped off the edge of a cliff into another dimension. The police conducted a systematic sweep of the surrounding area. They waded through the murky, green-brown waters of the Olentangy River, their long poles poking at the silt and debris on the bottom. They climbed into giant, rusted trash compactors, braving the overwhelming stench of rotting food and urban waste. They used thermal imaging from helicopters that circled the city like predatory birds, searching for a heat signature that shouldn't be there. They found nothing. No olive green shirt, no broken glasses. No cell phone. As the days bled into weeks, the silence of the community became its own kind of wall. Despite the thousands of missing flyers that were taped to every telephone pole and shop window, Brian's smiling face staring back at the very people who might have bumped into him that night, no one came forward with a concrete lead. In a city of thousands, in a bar of hundreds, it was as if everyone had suddenly developed a collective amnesia. The power of money didn't cover the truth here. Instead, it was the sheer, baffling lack of evidence. There were no bloodstains, there was no signs of a struggle. The cell phone companies tracked Brian's phone pings, which continued to bounce off a tower in Hilliard, several miles away, for days after he disappeared. This suggested the phone was still alive, a digital heartbeat in the darkness. But every time the police moved toward the signal, it seemed to retreat further into the shadows. Randy Schaefer, Brian's father, became a permanent fixture on the streets of Columbus. He was a man hollowed out by grief, his eyes sunken, and his voice a rasping shadow of what it once was. He would walk the perimeter of the Ugly Tuna Saloona at 3 o'clock in the morning, the cold wind whipping his coat, whispering his son's name into the dark. He was looking for the gap, the one detail the police had missed. He was convinced that the answer lay within those walls, hidden behind a panel of drywall or beneath a slab of freshly poured concrete. But the deadlock held firm. The case was a masterpiece of absence. The more the police searched, the more the void seemed to expand. They were looking for a man who had walked into a room with one way in and one way out, and then simply erased himself from the narrative of the living. And as the initial frenzy of the search began to wane, replaced by the grim, quiet reality of a cold case file, the city of Columbus began to look at the Ugly Tuna Saloona not as a place of celebration, but as a monument to the inexplicable. For months, the city of Columbus, Ohio, remained in a state of suspended animation. The missing posters of Brian Schaefer, once crisp and vibrant, began to yellow and curl at the edges, their corners whipped into tatters by the persistent Midwestern wind. But for Alexis Wagoner, Brian's girlfriend, the search wasn't a matter of civic duty or professional obligation. It was a visceral, nightly ritual of hope and despair. Every single night, before she tried to force herself into a fitful sleep, she would sit in the heavy, suffocating silence of her bedroom, pick up her phone, and dial Brian's number. She knew the routine by heart. She would press the green call button, hold the cold plastic of the phone against her ear, and wait for the immediate, hollow click that signaled the call was being diverted to voicemail. It was a way of staying connected to a ghost, a way of hearing his recorded voice say his name one last time. But in September of 2006, 6 full months after Brian had vanished into the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a random fluke occurred that sent a jolt of pure electric adrenaline through her soul. She dialed the number, she waited for the click, but it didn't come. Instead, the line stayed open. Ring, ring, ring. Alexis froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound was different. It wasn't the flat, electronic tone of a system error. It was the rhythmic, pulsing sound of a phone that was actually turned on. A phone that was searching for a connection. A phone that was sitting somewhere, perhaps in a dark pocket or on a dusty shelf, vibrating with the force of her longing. She called again, and again. She called until her thumb was sore from pressing the buttons. Each time, it rang 3 times before cutting out. She immediately contacted the police, convinced that this was the turning point, the moment the predator had finally slipped up, or the moment Brian had finally found a way to charge his device. The investigators scrambled. They reached out to the cellular service providers, their fingers flying across keyboards as they tried to triangulate the source of that digital heartbeat. They traced the ping to a cell tower in Hilliard, Ohio, about 14 miles away from the Ugly Tuna Saloona. It was a suburban area, a place of manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs. They rushed to the location, their sirens silent to avoid tipping off anyone who might be holding Brian captive. They searched the fields, they knocked on doors, they used sophisticated equipment to scan for a signal. But as quickly as the window had opened, it slammed shut. The phone stopped ringing. The ping vanished into the ether. The service provider later suggested it might have been a glitch in the system, a ghost in the machine caused by a database update or a temporary server error. To the police, it was a technical anomaly. To Alexis, it was a cruel, mocking whisper from the void. It was a random fluke that offered a glimmer of light, only to plunge her back into a deeper darkness. As the years began to grind forward, the belated intervention took on a more desperate, almost supernatural tone. Desperate for answers, Brian's father, Randy, began to consult with psychics and remote viewers, people who claimed they could see into the dark side of the world. One psychic told him that Brian's body was submerged in water near a bridge with a specific iron railing. Randy, driven by a father's relentless resilience, spent his weekends wading through freezing streams and peering under every bridge in Franklin County, his eyes searching for a flash of olive green fabric or the glint of a watch. The police, meanwhile, reinvestigated the gap in the security footage. They began to look at the Ugly Tuna Saloona not as a single room, but as a complex machine with many moving parts. They realized that while the main escalator was the only way for customers to leave, there were other possibilities. They looked at the band that had played that night, the Dead Schembechlers. They interviewed the musicians, the roadies, and the people who helped carry the heavy amplifiers and drum kits out of the bar at 3 o'clock in the morning. They wondered, could Brian have been hidden inside a large equipment case? Could he have been smuggled out in the middle of a chaotic loadout? They rewatched the footage of the band leaving, frame by frame, looking for a case that seemed too heavy, a roadie who seemed too nervous, or a turning point that had been missed in the initial frenzy. But the boxes were just boxes, and the men were just tired musicians. Then, there was the resilience of the internet sleuths. In the era of burgeoning social media, the case of Brian Schaefer became a global obsession. Thousands of people who had never set foot in Ohio began to dissect the floor plans of the Ugly Tuna Saloona. They pointed out a blind spot in the construction area, a single, unmonitored exit that led to a back alley. If Brian had stepped through that door, he would have been invisible to the cameras. But where would he have gone? He had no money, no car, and no reason to run. The belated intervention of DNA testing and modern forensics also failed to yield results. Investigators returned to the now-finished building that housed the bar. They used ground-penetrating radar to look through the concrete floors, searching for the meticulous preparation of a killer who might have buried Brian in the foundation. They found nothing but soil and rebar. The building was solid, its secrets locked away in stone. Every random fluke, a reported sighting in a Mexican beach town, a grainy photo of a man who looked like Brian in a European train station, was chased down and debunked. Each time, the result was the same, a dead end. The turning point never arrived. The predator, if there was one, had left no gap. They had executed a perfect vanishing, or perhaps the environment itself had simply edited Brian Schaefer out of existence. The extreme tension of the search never truly broke. It just plateaued into a dull, aching silence that would eventually lead to a final, tragic conclusion. The passage of time is a cruel, eroding force. It wears down the sharp edges of grief until they become a dull, constant ache, and it bleeds the color from even the most vivid memories. For the Schaefer family, the years following 2006 were not marked by milestones of joy, but by the hollow resonance of futility. The search for Brian had become a marathon with no finish line, a series of locked doors with no keys. The ultimate tragedy, the one that felt like a jagged exclamation point on an already nonsensical sentence, occurred in September of 2008. A violent, howling windstorm ripped through central Ohio, tearing limbs from ancient oaks and sending debris dancing through the darkened streets. Randy Schaefer, the man who had spent every waking hour of the last 2 years breathing life into his son's ghost, was outside his home in Baltimore, Ohio, clearing away fallen branches. In a freak, momentary lapse of nature's mercy, a heavy bough from a nearby tree snapped with a sound like a bone breaking. It fell through the dark, damp air and struck Randy, killing him instantly. He died as he had lived since that Friday night in March, searching, waiting, and wondering. His obituary was a heartbreaking testament to a father's love, and his passing left Brian's younger brother, Derek, as the sole guardian of a mystery that seemed determined to outlive them all. The Ugly Tuna Saloona eventually succumbed to the shifting tides of the city as well. The neon blue lights were extinguished, the thumping bass fell silent, and in 2018, the establishment closed its doors for the last time. The space was gutted, the walls that Brian might have leaned against were torn down, and the void was remodeled into something new, something sterile. But for those who remember, the building remains a haunted cathedral of the inexplicable. The metallic sound of locks clicking shut at the end of each night still carries the weight of a man who went in and never came out. To this day, the file on Brian Schaefer sits in a drawer at the Columbus Police Department. It is thousands of pages long, a sprawling epic of police deadlock. There is no justice in this story, only the cold, lingering scent of damp concrete and the static of a phone line that rings into nothingness. Alexis eventually moved on, as the living must do, But she, like the rest of the world, is left with the same agonizing question that began on that silver escalator. How does a human being simply cease to be? But Brian Schaefer's story, as haunting as it is a mystery of a man lost in a crowd. Sometimes, the strange, dark, and mysterious doesn't hide in the neon lights of a city bar. Sometimes, it waits in the vast, suffocating silence of the wilderness. It waits for those who wander off the beaten path, leading them into a trap where logic fails and the environment itself becomes a predator. We leave the paved streets of Ohio behind and travel west toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. There, we find another mystery, one that involves not one man, but five. Five friends who drove into the woods on a clear night and encountered something so terrifying, so fundamentally wrong, that it stripped away their reason and left them to perish in a landscape that defied every instinct of survival. The sun began its slow amber descent over the flat, fertile valley of Yuba City, California, on the evening of February 24, 1978. It was a Friday, and for most people in this quiet agricultural hub, the coming weekend promised a familiar rhythm of rest and routine. But for five young men, Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, the air crackled with a very specific, electric kind of excitement. They weren't just friends, they were teammates, members of a local basketball team for the intellectually disabled called the Gateway Gators. And tomorrow, Saturday, was the day they had been practicing for all season, their first big tournament in the Special Olympics. The illusion of normalcy was draped over Yuba City like a warm, heavy blanket. You could smell the scent of damp earth from the surrounding orchards and the faint, savory aroma of family dinners being prepared in the modest tract houses that line the streets. Inside the homes of these five men, the atmosphere was one of joyful preparation. Take 32-year-old Ted Wire, for instance. Ted was a giant of a man with a heart that seemed even larger than his frame. He had a round, friendly face and a laugh that could fill a room. That evening, he was buzzing around his house, meticulously laying out his white and green basketball jersey on his bed. He checked his sneakers 3 times to make sure the laces weren't frayed. His mother, Mrs. Wire, watched him with a mixture of pride and amusement. She saw him double-check his sports bag, ensuring his clean socks and a snack were packed. To Ted, this wasn't just a game. It was a moment of profound importance, a chance to shine in a world that often overlooked him. Across town, 30-year-old Jack Madruga was washing his pride and joy, a 1969 turquoise and white Mercury Montego. He moved the sponge in slow, rhythmic circles, the soapy water glistening under the porch light. Jack was a veteran, a man who took immense pride in his ability to navigate the world independently. He was the designated driver of the group, the one everyone relied on for his steady hand and his knowledge of the local roads. As he polished the chrome bumper, the metallic scent of car wax mingled with the cool evening air. He wasn't just preparing a car, he was preparing a vessel for their shared adventure. Meanwhile, 24-year-old Jack Hewitt, the youngest and most sensitive of the group, was sitting at his kitchen table. He was a shy man who suffered from severe intellectual disabilities and relied heavily on his family and his friends for guidance. His mother, Jackie, watched him as he talked animatedly about the game. He wasn't a man of many words, but his excitement was palpable in the way his hands moved and the way his eyes lit up. There was a profound sense of safety in their community, a belief that these men, despite their vulnerabilities, were shielded by the collective watchfulness of their neighbors and the predictable nature of their lives. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, the five men piled into Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego. The engine roared to life with a comforting mechanical growl. They were heading north to Chico, about 50 miles away, to watch a college basketball game. It was meant to be a simple, dry run for the next day's excitement, a fun night out before the serious business of the tournament began. As they drove out of Yuba City, the lights of the town faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the vast, dark stretches of the California highway. However, as they moved further away from the safety of their homes, the predator's mask began to reveal itself. In this story, the predator wasn't a person lurking in the bushes, it was the landscape itself, masked by the deceptive beauty of a moonlit night. To an outsider, the Plumas National Forest, the rugged, mountainous wilderness that rose up to the east, looked like a majestic backdrop of pine trees and granite peaks. But to those who knew the terrain, it was a labyrinth of treacherous logging roads, steep ravines, and unpredictable weather. The mask was also worn by the night itself. On the surface, it was a clear, crisp evening. But as the men finished watching the game in Chico and stopped at a local market to buy snacks, a Clark bar for Ted, some milk, and a few sodas, the atmosphere began to shift. The air grew thinner, the temperature began to plummet, and the shadows cast by the towering trees grew longer and more jagged. There was a witness that night, a man named Joseph Shans, who would later provide a glimpse into the predator's mask. He was driving his own car up a steep mountain road in the Plumas National Forest, far, far away from the direct route back to Yuba City, when his vehicle became stuck in the deepening snow. As he sat there, clutching his chest in the throes of a mild heart attack, he saw a pair of headlights pull up behind him. Through the frosted glass of his window, he saw a group of figures standing in the glare of the lights. He saw a woman holding a baby, or so it seemed, in his pain delirium. He shouted for help, but the figures remained silent, their faces obscured by the darkness and the swirling flurries of snow that had begun to fall. They weren't moving toward him, they were simply there, standing on the edge of a void, watching the world fade away. These figures, whoever they were, represented the moment the normalcy of the evening was replaced by something cold and inexplicable. The 5 men in their turquoise Mercury were no longer on the highway. They had turned off the main road and were now ascending into the heart of the mountains, driving higher and higher into a territory where they didn't belong. The predator, the freezing altitude, and the disorienting darkness was beginning to tighten its grip. Behind the mask of a fun Friday night out, a nightmare was unfolding in slow motion, and the 5 friends were driving straight into its center, leaving the warmth of Yuba City and the cheers of the basketball court far behind them in the dust. The neon sign for Bear's Market flickered with a rhythmic buzz, casting a pale, artificial glow onto the asphalt of Chico, California. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the evening. Inside the store, the air smelled of floor wax and over-ripened fruit. The 5 men, Ted, Jack Madruga, Bill, Jack Hewitt, and Gary, moved through the aisles with a lighthearted energy that bordered on giddiness. They had just watched UC Davis defeat Chico State, and the thrill of the game was still surging through them. They gathered their supplies for the trip back to Yuba City, several Hostess fruit pies, a few chocolate bars, a carton of milk, and some soda. The clerk, a woman who would later remember their friendly demeanor, watched as they piled their snacks onto the counter. There was no sign of distress, no sense of urgency. They paid their bill, climbed back into the 1969 Mercury Montego, and pulled out of the parking lot. At this point, the sudden incident didn't happen with a crash or a scream. It happened with a single, inexplicable turn of the steering wheel. To get back to Yuba City, Jack Madruga needed to head south on Highway 99. It was a straight, well-lit shot that would have put them in their own beds in less than an hour. But instead, for reasons that remain one of the greatest mysteries in forensic history, the turquoise Mercury turned east. It began to climb. The initial chaos of this story was a slow-motion descent into madness. As the car moved away from the valley floor, the elevation began to rise rapidly. The temperature inside the car, once warm and smelling of chocolate and upholstery, began to drop as the heater struggled against the thinning mountain air. The road beneath them, the Oroville-Quincy Highway, shifted from smooth pavement to a winding, narrow ribbon of asphalt that hugged the edges of steep ravines. Around 11 o'clock, the car reached an elevation of nearly 4,500 feet. This was high country, a place of jagged granite and ancient, towering pines. And it was here that the snow began to appear. At first, it was just a light dusting on the shoulders of the road, but as they climbed higher, it became a thick, white shroud that swallowed the headlights. Then, the car stopped. The Mercury Montego was found days later at an elevation of nearly 4,400 feet, parked in a clearing on a narrow logging road. This is where the initial chaos takes a turn into the truly bizarre. The car wasn't stuck. Investigators would later prove that the car had plenty of gas, the engine was in perfect working order, and even with the snow, it could have been easily backed out or pushed. And yet, the 5 men simply got out. Imagine the scene. It is nearly midnight. The wind is howling through the pines, a mournful, high-pitched whistle that sounds like a human cry. The temperature is hovering well below freezing. 5 men, dressed only in light spring jackets and basketball jerseys, are standing in knee-deep snow in total, crushing darkness. They are 70 miles in the wrong direction. In the distance, through the swirling white curtain of the blizzard, they might have seen a flickering light. This was the car of Joseph Shans, the man having a heart attack just a few hundred yards away. He would later recall hearing whistling sounds and seeing the dim glow of flashlights moving through the trees. He shouted for help, his voice cracking with pain and terror. But the figures didn't move toward him. They didn't come to his rescue. Instead, they began to walk. They didn't walk back down the road toward the safety of the valley. They walked deeper into the forest, following a snow-covered trail that led toward a destination that didn't exist. There was no forceful grab, no sliding van door. The sudden incident was a collective psychological break from reality. As they marched into the blackness, the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the fresh powder. One by one, the lights of the car faded behind them until there was nothing left but the cold, the wind, and the terrifying realization that they were lost in a world that had no intention of letting them go. The initial chaos was a silent one, a quiet surrender to the elements that defied every rule of human survival. They were moving away from the illusion of normalcy and into a frozen tomb, driven by a logic that died with them on that mountain. If we look at the Plumas National Forest as the predator in this narrative, we must recognize that its meticulous preparation began millions of years ago. This is a landscape designed to consume the unwary. At an elevation of nearly 4,500 feet, the air doesn't just get colder, it gets thinner, starved of the vital oxygen that fuels the human brain's ability to reason. This is the dark side of the mountain, a psychological pressure cooker where the walls are made of towering Douglas firs and the ceiling is a suffocating blanket of black, freezing fog. The secret basement of this predator was a small, unassuming structure located 19 miles away from where the turquoise Mercury Montego had been abandoned. It was a Forest Service trailer, a simple silver and white box sitting in a clearing known as Rogers Cow Camp. To any rational person, this trailer was a sanctuary. It was a soundproofed system against the howling winds of the Sierra Nevada. Inside, the predator had provided everything a person would need to survive a winter's siege. There were cabinets overflowing with sea rations, heavy, olive-drab cans filled with beef stew, fruit cocktail, and ham and lima beans. There were stacks of thick wool blankets. There was a large propane tank sitting outside, connected to a heating system that could have turned the interior of that trailer into a warm, cozy haven with the simple flick of a match. There was even a shed nearby filled with dry firewood. But the predator has a way of warping the mind. When we analyze the psychology of what happened inside that trailer, we encounter a horror far deeper than simple freezing. Imagine the 5 men reaching this trailer after a grueling 19-mile trek through waist-deep snow. They are exhausted, their lungs burning from the altitude, their feet likely numb and blackening from frostbite. They break a window and climb inside. They find the blankets, they find the food, and yet the meticulous preparation of the environment begins to work against them. Ted Wire, the man who had been so meticulous about his basketball jersey, was the one who would spend the longest time in this silver tomb. For 8 agonizing weeks, he lay on a bunk inside that trailer. He wrapped himself in 8 thick blankets. He sat inches away from a locker filled with enough food to feed all 5 men for an entire year. And yet, as the predator watched from the shadows of the forest, Ted Wire slowly starved to death. He didn't open the cans of food. Only 11 of the dozens of rations were consumed. He didn't turn on the heat. He didn't light a fire. The psychology at play here is a dark, twisting labyrinth. Was it a profound, paralyzing fear that kept them from making noise or light? Did they believe that something was outside in the woods, waiting for them to show a sign of life? In the dark side of the predator's lair, logic is replaced by a primitive, survival-based terror. The preparation wasn't just the trailer, it was the isolation. The trailer was located in a place so remote that during the winter months, it was effectively on another planet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the groan of the trailer's metal skin as it contracted in the sub-zero temperatures. A predator like this doesn't need to strike with a blade. It simply waits. It waits for the cold to seep through the floorboards. It waits for the hunger to dim the eyes. It waits for the meticulous order of a young man's life to unravel into a desperate, shivering mess. The trailer, meant to be a lighthouse in the storm, became a coffin. The soundproofing was the heavy snow that piled up against the door, sealing them in. As Ted Wire grew weaker, his body wasting away from over 200 pounds to a mere 120, the predator remained patient. It had stripped these men of their one advantage, their connection to each other and their ability to think clearly. Outside, the forest stood like a silent army, its branches heavy with the weight of the sudden incident. The mountain had set a trap using the very tools of survival, proving that sometimes the most terrifying secret basement is the one you walk into willingly, thinking you've finally found safety. The morning of Saturday, February 25th, 1978, should have been the proudest day in the lives of the Gateway Gators. In the gymnasiums of Yuba City, the sound of basketballs thumping against polished hardwood and the shrill, rhythmic chirp of referee whistles filled the air. But at the Weiher household and the Madruga household, in the homes of the other three men, there was only a thick, suffocating silence. The white and green jerseys remained untouched on the beds, the gym bags sat packed and waiting by the front doors. As the hours ticked past the scheduled tip-off time, the police deadlock began to settle over the valley like a cold, gray fog. The families didn't wait for the sun to set before raising the alarm. They knew these men. They knew that for Ted Weiher to miss a basketball tournament, something had to be catastrophically wrong. They knew that Jack Madruga would never, under any circumstances, allow his pristine Mercury Montego to be unaccounted for. But when the families first approached the authorities, they were met with a social and psychological barrier that is all too common in cases involving the marginalized. The initial police response was tempered by a dismissive logic. These were grown men, the officers reasoned. Perhaps they had simply decided to extend their night out. Maybe they had driven to a different town or met some girls. But the families fought back with a desperate, frantic energy. "You don't understand, Mrs." Weiher told the detectives, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "Ted doesn't just run off. He is a creature of habit. He lives for that game. If he isn't here, he is in trouble." The minor errors that often haunt a disappearance began almost immediately. Because the men were adults, there was a mandatory waiting period before a full-scale search could be launched. Those precious first 24 hours, when the trail was still fresh and the scents hadn't been washed away by the elements, were lost to bureaucracy. Then came the weather. On the evening of the 25th, a massive, vengeful winter storm slammed into the Sierra Nevada mountains. The temperature plummeted into the single digits, and the sky opened up, dumping inches of heavy, wet snow every hour. The Plumas National Forest, already a labyrinth, was transformed into a white fortress. On Tuesday, February 28th, 5 days after the disappearance, a forest ranger spotted a flash of turquoise through the trees on a remote logging road near Rogers Cow Camp. It was the Mercury Montego. The police descended on the site, their four-wheel drive vehicles churning through the deep drifts. What they found was the ultimate deadlock. The car was locked, it was in perfect mechanical condition, there was a quarter tank of gas left. The keys were gone, but when police hot-wired the ignition, the engine purred to life instantly. Inside, the floorboards were littered with the wrappers from the snacks they had bought at Bear's Market, the empty milk carton, the Hostess pie wrappers, but there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no frantic notes left on the dashboard. The detectives stood in the middle of that frozen road, staring at the car, and they were paralyzed by the social barrier of their own expectations. They couldn't conceive of why 5 men, some of whom were terrified of the dark and the cold, would step out of a warm, functional vehicle and vanish into a blizzard. They looked at the mud on the tires and concluded that the car must have spun its wheels once or twice. In their report, they noted the car was stuck, a minor error in judgment that would steer the investigation in the wrong direction for months. They launched a search, but the mountain fought them at every turn. Search parties on snowmobiles were blinded by the whiteout conditions. Helicopters, those great mechanical birds of prey, were grounded by the turbulent winds. The searchers focused their efforts on the immediate vicinity of the car, assuming that the men couldn't have traveled more than a mile or two in such brutal conditions. They didn't look 19 miles up the road toward the Forest Service trailer. To the searchers, that distance seemed physically impossible for men dressed in light jackets. The social barrier extended to the testimony of Joseph Shawns. When he told the police about the figures he saw in the woods and the woman with the baby, the investigators were skeptical. They viewed him as a man who had suffered a heart attack and was likely hallucinating from pain and the thinning oxygen of the high altitude. His account, which could have been a vital clue to the timing of the disappearance, was filed away as the ramblings of a distressed witness. For the next 5 months, the deadlock was absolute. The snow grew deeper, burying the Mercury Montego and any footprints that might have remained. The families in Yuba City lived in a state of agonizing limbo, their lives frozen in the moment of that Friday night. They were trapped in a community that wanted to move on, a society that viewed the disappearance of 5 slow men as a tragic but inevitable accident of nature. But the silence of the mountain is never permanent. It is merely a pause. As the spring sun began to exert its influence, peeling back the layers of ice and snow, the dark side of the Plumas National Forest began to reveal what it had been hiding. The deadlock wouldn't be broken by a brilliant detective or a high-tech forensic breakthrough. It would be broken by the slow, indifferent melt of the seasons, revealing a horror that was far more complex and far more chilling than anyone had dared to imagine. The spring thaw of 1978 did not come to the Sierra Nevada with a gentle whisper. It arrived with the violent, rushing sound of 1,000 mountain streams gorged on melting ice. As the white shroud of winter began to recede, it peeled back the layers of a nightmare that had been frozen in time for over 100 days. The turning point in this investigation came not from a police tip, but from the simple desire of a few Sunday motorists to enjoy the high country air. On June 4th, 1978, a group of motorcyclists were navigating the winding, muddy logging roads near Rogers Cow Camp. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine needles and the sweet, heavy aroma of rotting vegetation, the smell of a forest waking up. As they rounded a bend, they saw it, the silver and white Forest Service trailer, sitting like a discarded toy in a clearing of mud and melting slush. One of the men approached the trailer. He noticed a window had been smashed out, the jagged glass glinting in the sunlight like a row of broken teeth. He stepped onto the metal porch, and as he reached for the door handle, a turning point of sensory horror struck him. It was a smell, a heavy, cloying, and sickly sweet scent that seemed to cling to the back of his throat. He pushed the door open. Inside, the light was dim and filtered through the grime of the windows, and there, lying on one of the bunks, was Ted Weiher. The extreme tension of that moment is hard to overstate. Ted was barely recognizable. The man who had weighed over 200 pounds just 4 months prior was now a skeletal figure of barely 120 pounds. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over his cheekbones. A thick, unkempt beard covered his face, and his feet, once so steady on the basketball court, were now a horrific, blackened mess of gangrene and frostbite. He was wrapped in 8 thick wool blankets, tucked in so tightly it looked as if he had been prepared for a funeral. Beside him, on a small wooden table, sat a gold watch. It didn't belong to Ted. It was a random fluke, an object that suggested someone else had been in that room, watching him, perhaps even winding the watch while Ted slowly slipped away. As the police returned to the mountain, the belated intervention of a full-scale search finally bore its grim fruit. They began to retrace the 19-mile path from the abandoned Mercury Montego to the trailer, and that is when they found the others. On the road to the trailer, they found the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. Nature had been cruel to them. Their bodies had been partially scavenged by the predators of the forest, leaving behind a scattered trail of bone and tattered clothing. Jack Madruga's body was found lying face down in the brush, his hand reaching out as if toward a goal he could never quite touch. Bill Sterling was found just a short distance away, his remains nestled in a bed of pine needles. The discovery of Jack Hewitt was perhaps the most heart-wrenching. His father, a man who had refused to give up hope, accompanied the search parties. It was he who found his son's remains, not a body, but a collection of bones and a pair of Levi's jeans draped over a bush. He recognized his son's clothing, a turning point of grief that echoed through the silent trees. But the most chilling discovery inside the trailer was the negligence of the victim's own survival instincts. The investigators found dozens of C-ration cans. They were stacked in the cabinets just inches from where Ted Weiher had spent his final days. Only 11 had been opened. There was a P38 can opener, a simple metal tool sitting on the counter. Why hadn't they eaten? There was a propane tank outside, full and ready to provide heat. Why had they stayed in the freezing dark? And then there was the gap, the mystery of Gary Mathias. In the trailer, the police found Gary's sneakers. This was a random fluke that chilled the blood of every investigator. It meant that Gary Mathias, the man with the most survival training, had definitely made it to the trailer. He had taken off his own shoes and presumably put on a pair of Ted Weiher's leather boots to head back out into the snow. But Gary Mathias was never found. His body, his clothing, even a trace of his scent vanished. The extreme tension of the investigation shifted from where they were to what had happened in those final weeks. Had they been hiding from something? Was Gary Mathias in a state of psychiatric crisis without his medication, the one who prevented the others from using the supplies? Or had they seen something in the woods, the figures Joseph Shawns described, that convinced them that making a fire or opening a can would signal their location to a predator? The belated intervention of the search ended in a cemetery, not a courtroom. The random fluke of the melting snow had solved the riddle of their location, but it had replaced it with a psychological puzzle that would never be solved. The resilience of the human spirit had carried them 19 miles through a blizzard, but once they reached the safety of the trailer, Some invisible barrier or some deep-seated terror had turned that sanctuary into a tomb. The small clapboard churches of Yuba City were filled to capacity in the sweltering heat of June 1978. The air inside was thick, not just with the scent of funeral lilies and old hymnals, but with a heavy, collective sense of futility. 5 caskets were laid out across the valley over the course of that week, though one of them, the one belonging to Gary Mathias, remained agonizingly empty. The funerals for Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jack Hewitt were not just farewells to beloved sons and friends, they were the final, quiet whimpers of a mystery that had shouted for attention for 4 long months. Mrs. Weiher sat in the front pew, her hands gripping a lace handkerchief until her knuckles turned white. She stared at the polished wood of Ted's casket, her mind stuck in a loop of the same why? Why had her son, a man who loved his comforts and his routines, chosen to lie in a freezing trailer for 8 weeks and slowly waste away? There was no justice to be found in the courtroom, no perpetrator to lead away in handcuffs. The killer was a mountain, a blizzard, and a psychological fog that no law could ever penetrate. The aftermath for the Gateway Gators was a landscape of broken dreams. The basketball tournament they had practiced for so diligently was long over, the trophies awarded to other teams, the cheers of the crowd, a distant, mocking echo. The team's jerseys, once symbols of pride and belonging, were folded away into mothballed boxes in the backs of closets. The illusion of normalcy had been shattered so violently that even the simple act of bouncing a ball on a driveway felt like a betrayal of the boys who never came home. The fate of Jack Hewitt's family was particularly harrowing. His father, the man who had found his son's remains among the manzanita bushes, never truly left that mountain. He became a shadow of himself, his eyes always searching the horizon for a detail he might have missed. He lived the rest of his life haunted by the metallic sound of locks that weren't there, the mental barriers that had kept his son from simply walking down a road to safety. And then there was Gary Mathias. Gary became a ghost, a name whispered in the dark corners of local diners and police stations. To this day, he has never been found. The discovery of his sneakers in the trailer proved he was there, but the forest swallowed him whole. Some theorize he suffered a total psychiatric break and wandered deeper into the wilderness until the cold claimed him. Others, driven by the extreme tension of the unexplained, I wonder if Gary was the predator in the group's midst, the one whose military training and survival skills were warped by a lack of medication into something dark and controlling. But without a body, there is only futility. The lessons learned from the American Dyatlov Pass are grim and unsettling. They remind us that the human mind, when stripped of its familiar surroundings and pushed to the edge of survival, does not always follow the path of logic. It shows us that fear can be a more effective barrier than a brick wall, and that sometimes a sanctuary like a trailer filled with food can become a tomb if the spirit inside has already surrendered. The case files were eventually moved to a cold case status, the pages yellowing, the ink of the minor errors and random flukes fading into history. As the sun sets over the Sierra Nevada, casting long purple shadows across the ridges where the Mercury Montego once sat, the mountain remains silent. It doesn't offer apologies. It doesn't explain the whistling sounds Joseph Shawns heard in the dark. It simply exists, a monument to the 5 men who drove toward a basketball game and ended up in a nightmare. But as we leave the frostbitten silence of California behind, we realize that the strange, dark, and mysterious isn't always about people failing to act in their own interest. Sometimes it is about people acting with a terrifying, deliberate purpose, following a set of instructions that seem to come from another world entirely. We travel now thousands of miles south, to the lush, emerald green hills of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The year is 1966. The air is humid, smelling of salt spray and tropical flora. 2 men, both skilled technicians, leave their homes with a suitcase full of money and a very specific plan. They climb a steep hill during a rainstorm, not to seek shelter, but to perform a ritual. When they are found, they aren't just dead, they are wearing suit jackets, and resting over their eyes are 2 crudely fashioned, handmade masks made of lead. The morning of August 17, 1966, in the city of Campos dos Goitacazes, Brazil, began with the rhythmic, comforting sounds of a neighborhood coming to life. This was a place where the air was often thick with the sweet, cloying scent of burning sugarcane from the nearby plantations and the sharp, salty tang of the Atlantic breeze. In a small, cluttered electronics repair shop on a side street, 2 men were preparing for what appeared to be a standard business trip. Manuel Pereira da Cruz, A 32-year-old with a steady hand and a keen eye for circuitry stood at his workbench. To his neighbors, Manuel was the embodiment of the illusion of normalcy. He was a family man, a respected technician who could coax life back into the most stubborn of radio sets or the flickering, monochrome television screens that were becoming the centerpiece of Brazilian living rooms. Beside him was his friend and partner, 34-year-old Miguel Jose Viana. Miguel was the more talkative of the two, a man who navigated the social currents of their town with ease, always ready with a joke or a bit of local gossip. The workshop was a sanctuary of mid-century technology. The air was permeated with the metallic, biting scent of lead solder and the warm ozone smell of vacuum tubes heating up. On the wooden benches sat the tools of their trade: needle-nose pliers with worn rubber grips, spools of copper wire that glinted like gold in the morning sun, and heavy, black multimeters with swinging needles that measured the invisible pulse of electricity. To anyone looking through the window, they were just two industrious men preparing for a journey to the big city to buy supplies. Manuel's wife, Nelly, watched them pack. She saw them count out a staggering amount of money, 2,300,000 cruzeiros. It was a small fortune, a thick wad of bills that represented months of hard work and careful saving. They told her they were going to Niterói, a city across the bay from Rio de Janeiro, to purchase a second-hand car and a fresh stock of electronic components that were difficult to find in their smaller town. "We'll be back tomorrow night," Miguel said, offering a reassuring smile as he patted the pocket where the money was stashed. He looked like a man who had everything under control, a man who was simply moving toward a better future for his business. This was the predator's mask, though in this story, the predator was not a person with a knife or a gun. It was an idea, a dark, intoxicating obsession that had been festering beneath the surface of their orderly lives for months. Their neighbors saw them as simple technicians, but if they had looked closer, they would have noticed the predator's mask slipping. In the weeks leading up to this trip, Manuel and Miguel had been spending their late-night hours not on repairing customer radios, but on strange, secretive experiments in their backyard. They were fascinated by spiritualism and the burgeoning UFO phenomenon that was sweeping through South America in the mid-60s. They had been seen by a few curious onlookers building a strange metallic device in their garden, something that hummed with a low frequency and occasionally emitted a pale, eerie blue light. They had also become involved with a local spiritual group, a collection of individuals who believed that science and the supernatural were two sides of the same coin. It was here that they likely met the perpetrator of their demise, a philosophy, or perhaps a charismatic figure who convinced them that they were on the verge of a breakthrough. This figure, whoever they were, remained a shadow in the background, a silent architect of the plan Manuel and Miguel were now executing. By 9 o'clock that morning, the two men had boarded a bus for the long, bumpy ride to Niterói. They were dressed in neat, dark suits, looking more like bank managers than electronics repairmen. As the bus pulled away from the station, the familiar sights of Campos, the local market, the church tower, the waving neighbors began to recede. They were leaving the world of normalcy and stepping into a narrative that had been meticulously scripted by their own hidden desires. The journey was long, and the weather began to turn. As the bus wound its way toward the coast, the bright Brazilian sun was swallowed by a heavy gray curtain of clouds. A fine, persistent drizzle began to coat the windows, blurring the landscape into a series of indistinct green and gray smears. To the other passengers, Manuel and Miguel seemed calm, even meditative. They didn't talk much. They sat with their suitcases on their laps, staring out at the rain, perhaps visualizing the signals they were hoping to receive. They arrived in Niterói late in the afternoon. The city was a chaotic swirl of umbrellas and splashing tires. They stopped at a local shop and bought two identical plastic raincoats, transparent, cheap garments that looked like thin, shimmering skin. They also stopped at a small bar and purchased a single bottle of mineral water. The clerk at the bar would later remember them vividly. Not because they were aggressive, but because they seemed different, focused, almost robotic. They checked their watches constantly, as if they were operating on a schedule that had been calibrated down to the very second. The predator's mask was now fully in place. To the world, they were two men in suits, wet from the rain, carrying a bottle of water. But in their minds, they were explorers, about to cross a threshold that no one else could see. They turned away from the car dealerships and the electronics wholesalers they had promised to visit. Instead, they began to walk toward the outskirts of the city, toward a steep, overgrown hill known as Morro do Vintém. The hill rose up from the urban sprawl like a dark, hunched shoulder. Its slopes were covered in thick, tangled brush and sharp, jagged rocks that were now slick with the falling rain. As they began their ascent, the sound of the city, the honking horns, the shouting vendors began to fade, replaced by the rhythmic squelch of their shoes in the mud and the steady, insistent drumming of the rain on their plastic coats. They were climbing away from the illusion of normalcy, moving higher into a landscape where the rules of the everyday world would soon cease to apply. The ascent of Morro do Vintem was not a casual hike. It was a grueling, vertical struggle against the elements. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon on that Wednesday, the 17th of August, 1966, the light over Niterói had begun to fail prematurely, swallowed by a thick, bruised purple sky. The rain was no longer a drizzle. It had intensified into a cold, rhythmic downpour that turned the red earth of the hillside into a slick, treacherous slurry. Manuel and Miguel moved upward with a mechanical, eerie synchronicity. Each step was a deliberate victory over the gravity that sought to pull them back toward the safety of the city streets. Their identical, transparent plastic raincoats, bought only hours earlier, shimmered like the skin of some prehistoric reptile under the fading light. The plastic crinkled and snapped with every movement, a sharp, artificial sound that cut through the natural white noise of the storm. Underneath those cheap, shimmering layers, their dark suits were already beginning to absorb the dampness, the heavy wool becoming a weight they carried like a penance. The sudden incident in this story wasn't a flash of steel or a sudden shout in the dark. It was the moment they reached a small, natural plateau near the summit of the hill. It was a place where the vegetation seemed to thin out, providing a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, churning expanse of gray water that met the horizon in a blur of mist. In this moment, the two men stopped. They didn't look around in confusion, they didn't consult a map, they moved to a specific patch of grass as if they were arriving at a long-awaited appointment. Then, the initial chaos began, though it was a chaos of the soul rather than the body. To any observer watching from the thickets, the scene would have been profoundly unsettling. Amidst a raging tropical rainstorm, two grown men, professional technicians with families, waiting for them calmly laid down, side by side on the wet, muddy earth. They didn't seek shelter under the nearby trees, they didn't try to protect their expensive suits, they simply surrendered to the ground. There were no screams, there were no muffled sounds of a struggle. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain on the plastic coats and the distant, low rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very rock of the hill. In the city below, the lights were beginning to flicker on, thousands of tiny golden pinpricks of normalcy where people were sitting down to dinner, unaware that two of their own had just exited the human narrative. Back in Campos, the initial chaos was beginning to manifest as a growing, gnawing silence. Nellie, Manuel's wife, stood by the window of their home, her eyes fixed on the street where the bus from Niterói usually dropped off its passengers. The dinner she had prepared was cooling on the table, the steam disappearing into the humid air. She checked the clock. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. She walked to the electronics shop, the metallic sound of locks clicking as she opened the door, hoping against hope that perhaps they had returned early and gone straight to work. But the shop was a tomb of silent vacuum tubes and cold soldering irons. The absence of Manuel and Miguel was not a sudden bang. It was a vacuum, a hollow space in the community that began to pull at the nerves of everyone who knew them. On the hill, the two men had reached the 1830 mark, 6:30 in the evening, the time meticulously noted in their pocket diaries. This was the moment of the transition. They reached into their pockets and pulled out the lead masks. These were not festive disguises. They were heavy, crudely hand-cut pieces of lead piping, hammered flat into the shape of oversized sunglasses without earpieces. They were designed to shield the eyes, not from the sun, but from something far more intense. As the rain continued to wash over them, Manuel and Miguel placed these lead weights over their eyes, the cold, heavy metal pressed against their sockets, plunging their world into a final, absolute darkness. They lay there, two shimmering silver figures in the mud, clutching a single bottle of water, waiting for a signal that the rest of the world could not hear. The initial chaos was the total, silent break from their identities as technicians, fathers, and citizens. They were no longer Manuel and Miguel. They were two vessels waiting to be filled by the unknown, lying on a rain-soaked hill as the world they knew moved on without them. Unaware that on Morro do Vintem, the laws of biology were about to be replaced by the laws of a dark, technical ritual. To understand the dark side of Manuel and Miguel, we have to go back into that cluttered electronics shop in Campos weeks before they ever set foot on that bus. We have to look past the broken television sets and the tangled copper wire and peer into the flickering orange glow of their late-night obsession. You see, the predator in this story wasn't a man in a trench coat. It was a parasitic idea, a meticulously constructed delusion that had turned their workshop into a secret basement for the occult. Late at night, when the rest of the neighborhood was silent and the only sound was the rhythmic chirping of crickets, Manuel and Miguel would sit huddled over their workbench. But they weren't repairing radios. They were working with lead. The workshop would have been filled with the heavy metallic scent of lead being hammered and shaped. Imagine the sound: clink, 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 a rhythmic industrial heartbeat. They took sheets of lead piping, the kind used in heavy plumbing, and began to flatten them out. They weren't making components, they were crafting shields. With surgical precision, they cut the lead into 2 pairs of oversized rectangular masks. They didn't have eye holes, they didn't have straps. They were designed to be placed directly over the eyes, resting on the bridge of the nose like a heavy, suffocating weight. To a rational observer, this was madness. But to Manuel and Miguel, this was meticulous preparation. They believed they were protecting their retinas from a blinding, otherworldly light, a radiation that would accompany the signal they were so desperate to receive. The psychology at play here was a dangerous cocktail of mid-century scientific optimism and deep-seated spiritualist paranoia. They were technicians. They believed in frequencies, in waves, in the unseen forces that could be harnessed if one only had the right receiver. But they had crossed a line. Their soundproofing system was a mental one. They had insulated themselves from the warnings of their families and the logic of their profession, creating a vacuum where only their shared obsession could breathe. In the corner of the workshop, Miguel sat with a small leather-bound notebook. His handwriting was neat, the cursive script flowing with a cold, terrifyingly logical precision. He wasn't writing a diary, he was writing a manual for their own destruction. 1630, be at the determined place, he wrote. He was scheduling their death like a service call. 1830, swallow the capsule. After the effect, protect metals and wait for the signal. This capsule is the dark heart of the mystery. What was in it? In the weeks leading up to the trip, they had been seen visiting a local spiritualist who specialized in psychic medicine. The meticulous preparation involved preparing their bodies for a high vibrational contact. They weren't just taking a pill, they were ingesting a key. They believed that by poisoning their physical bodies just enough, they could thin the veil between this world and the next. There was a chilling, calculated nature to their preparation. They didn't just pack a bag, they curated a ritual. They chose their best suits because they believed they were going to a meeting of cosmic importance. They packed 2 small towels, clean, white, neatly folded to wipe away the sweat and the grime of the physical world once the signal arrived. They even brought a single bottle of water, not for hydration, but to wash down the capsule that would initiate the final sequence. The predator here, this cult-like ideology, had convinced them that their technical expertise was the only thing that mattered. They approached their own deaths as an engineering problem to be solved. The lead masks were the protection, the suits were the uniform, and the hill of Morro do Vintém was the antenna. As they sat in that shop, the blue light of a soldering iron casting long, distorted shadows against the walls, they were already gone. They had built a secret basement in their own minds, a place where the love of their wives and the safety of their homes could not reach them. Every snip of the lead shears, every drop of ink in the notebook was a step further away from humanity. They weren't victims of a sudden grab, they were victims of a slow, methodical seduction by the strange, dark, and mysterious. They were technicians who had decided to repair the universe, unaware that the universe didn't want to be fixed, and that the price of the signal would be everything they ever were. By the morning of Saturday, August 20th, 1966, the heavy tropical rains had finally relented, leaving Niterói draped in a thick, sweltering humidity that felt like a damp wool blanket. High atop Morro do Vintém, the air was no longer fresh with the scent of ozone and wet earth. Instead, it had become stagnant, heavy with a new, cloying sweetness that made the local birds go silent. The police deadlock didn't begin in a precinct or a courtroom. It began with an 18-year-old boy named Jorge da Costa Alves. Jorge had been wandering the slopes of the hill, his eyes scanning the horizon as he flew his kite. When the kite dipped low into a thicket of brush, he scrambled down the incline to retrieve it, only to find himself standing at the edge of a scene that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. There, lying side by side in a small, cleared patch of grass, were 2 figures. From a distance, they looked like fallen statues wrapped in shimmering, translucent skin. As Jorge stepped closer, the initial chaos of the discovery hit him. The two men were dressed in high-quality suits that were now stained with the red, iron-rich mud of the hillside. Over their faces lay the lead masks dull, gray slabs of heavy metal that sat over their eyes like the visors of medieval knights. Jorge didn't stick around to investigate. He turned and sprinted down the hill, his lungs burning, the image of those metallic faces burned into his mind. When the Niterói police arrived, led by detectives who were used to the grit and violence of urban crime, they were met with a scene that defied every professional instinct they possessed. They expected blood. There was none. They expected signs of a struggle, a knife wound, or the telltale bruising of a strangulation. They found only two men who appeared to have simply gone to sleep. The police deadlock was immediate and profound, rooted in a series of catastrophic minor errors that would essentially erase any chance of solving the case. Because the hill was steep and the heat was rising toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the recovery of the bodies was delayed for hours. By the time Manuel and Miguel were brought down to the morgue, the relentless Brazilian sun and the high humidity had accelerated the natural processes of decomposition. Then came the most devastating minor error of all. The coroner's office in Niterói was overwhelmed that weekend. The two technicians were placed in a cold room, but their internal organs were not properly preserved for a comprehensive toxicology screen. By the time a pathologist finally stood over them with a scalpel, the capsule mentioned in the notebook, the very thing that could have explained their deaths, had been absorbed into their tissues, leaving no chemical signature behind. The very evidence needed to bridge the gap between science and the supernatural had evaporated into the stagnant air of the morgue. As the detectives dug into the lives of the two men, they ran headfirst into a social and psychological barrier that was as thick as the brush on Morro do Vintém. They traveled to Campos dos Goitacazes and entered the electronics shop. They found the receipts for the lead piping, they found the discarded scraps of metal, but when they began to interview the local community, they were met with a wall of protective silence and hushed whispers. In 1966, Brazil was a place where the lines between traditional Catholicism, modern science, and the burgeoning Spiritist movement were blurred. The community knew that Manuel and Miguel were part of a secret circle, a group of men who believed they could contact beings from other dimensions. But to speak of it to the police was to invite ridicule, or worse, to draw the attention of the very entities the technicians had been chasing. The detectives found themselves wandering through a maze of occult jargon and pseudoscience, unable to find a single person willing to admit they knew the true purpose of the hill climb. Then there was the mystery of the money. 2,300,000 cruzeiros had vanished. If this had been a simple robbery, the perpetrator was a ghost. No one had seen anyone else on the hill that night. The men still wore their expensive watches. Their suits were intact. Their suitcases were nearby. Why would a thief take the cash but leave the jewelry and the equipment? The police deadlock tightened. Was the money a payment to some unseen figure? Or had it been hidden somewhere on the hill, a hoard that only the entities could find? The lead masks themselves became a psychological barrier for the investigators. They took the masks to university laboratories, hoping for a technical explanation. Were they antennas? Were they shields against a specific type of radiation? The scientists just shook their heads. They were just lead. Crude, hand-cut, plumbing-grade lead. The notebook found in Miguel's pocket was the final, mocking piece of the puzzle. It was written in a tone of such cold, bureaucratic certainty that it made the detective's blood run cold. 1830, swallow the capsule. After the effect, protect metals and wait for the signal. Who gave them the capsule? Who determined the signal? The police searched for a third man, a mentor or a leader who had manipulated these two technicians into a suicide pact. They looked for a charismatic cult leader, a rogue scientist, or a contactee who had promised them the stars, but every lead turned into a dead end. Every person they questioned seemed to be looking past the detectives, staring into a world the police couldn't see. By the end of the first month, the case had become a stagnant pool of theories. The police deadlock wasn't just a lack of evidence, it was a fundamental clash of worldviews. The police were looking for a killer with a motive. The evidence suggested a ritual with a purpose. They were stuck in a loop, rereading the same 4 lines of a notebook, staring at 2 pieces of gray metal, and wondering how 2 men could be so meticulously prepared for a journey that led only to a muddy grave on a hill called Vintém. The city of Niterói moved on, the rain continued to fall, and the file on the lead masks was moved to the bottom of the stack, a monument to the moment these strange, dark, and mysterious had simply outpaced the reach of the law. The discovery of the two men on the slopes of Morro du Vintem was not a clean or clinical event. When the police finally reached the small, muddy plateau on that sweltering Saturday, they were met with a scene that felt less like a crime and more like a discarded stage set. The boy, Jorge, stood at the base of the hill, his kite string tangled in his shaking fingers, while the investigators picked their way through the waist-high grass. As they approached the bodies, the extreme tension of the scene was palpable. The two technicians lay perfectly parallel, their dark suits now a bruised, earthy brown from the rain and the mud. The turning point occurred when the lead investigator, a man who had seen 1,000 bullet wounds and stabbings, reached out with a gloved hand and lifted one of the lead masks. Underneath the heavy, hand-hammered metal, the eyes of Manuel Pereira de Cruz were closed. There was no sign of terror, no burst capillaries of a struggle, just a haunting, peaceful mask of death. But the gap, the one detail that didn't fit the narrative of a peaceful transition, was the scent. Beyond the cloying sweetness of the tropical heat, there was a faint metallic tang. The random fluke that would both ignite and eventually extinguish the investigation was found tucked into the damp pocket of Miguel Jose Viana's jacket. It was a small orange and white notebook, its pages swollen with moisture. When the detectives peeled the pages apart, they found the schedule that would become world famous. It wasn't a suicide note, it was a technical manual. 1830, swallow the capsule. After the effect, protect metals and wait for the signal. This was the turning point. The police realized they weren't looking for a traditional killer. They were looking for a third man, someone who had provided the capsules, someone who had orchestrated the signal. There was another random fluke found at the scene, a single empty plastic bottle of mineral water and two small white towels. The towels were folded with a neatness that bordered on the obsessive. In the middle of a wilderness, during a torrential rainstorm, why would two men be concerned with keeping their faces clean? This suggested a moment of negligence on the part of the victims, or perhaps their manipulator. They had followed the instructions to the letter, but the instructions had led them to a dead end. The belated intervention of the law came months later, when the police arrested a man named Elcio Correa Silva. He was a fellow electronics enthusiast and a friend of the two victims. The random fluke of a witness sighting placed Elcio in Niterói on the day of the disappearance. The police suspected him of being the predator, the man who had pocketed the 2,300,000 cruzeros. During the interrogation, the tension was thick enough to taste. Elcio admitted that he, Manuel, and Miguel were part of a scientific spiritualist group. He spoke of contact, of beings from other worlds, and of a test of faith. But when the detectives pressed him on the money and the capsules, Elcio's resilience was unbreakable. He claimed he had nothing to do with their deaths. He pointed toward a higher power as the architect of the plan. Without a bite mark or a digital photo to link him to the scene, the police deadlock remained. But the most significant negligence in this story didn't come from Elcio. It came from the state itself. Because the coroner had failed to properly preserve the organs, the belated intervention of modern toxicology was rendered useless. When the bodies were exhumed years later for a second look, there was nothing left for the scientists to find. The random fluke of the missing money remained the most glaring piece of evidence. If they were there for a spiritual contact, why bring a fortune? If they were there to buy a car, why climb a hill with lead masks? Every lead, a reported bright orange light hovering over the hill that night, a sighting of a silver object in the sky, served only to distract the investigators. No matter how careful the predator be, it a man or an idea had been, they had left behind a notebook and a bottle of water. But in the humid, chaotic world of 1966 Brazil, these clues were like smoke in a windstorm. The turning point had arrived and passed, leaving the investigators staring at two pieces of lead and a schedule for a meeting that never happened. The resilience of the mystery was stronger than the resilience of the law, and the discovery on Morro du Vintem remained a riddle wrapped in a lead mask, buried under the weight of futility. The weeks following the discovery on Morro du Vintem saw the city of Campos dos Goitacazes return to its rhythmic, sugarcane-scented life. But for the families of Manuel and Miguel, the illusion of normalcy had been permanently incinerated. The small electronics shop, once a hub of buzzing activity and technical ingenuity, became a silent tomb. Nellie would eventually have to stand in that workspace, surrounded by the metallic smell of cold solder and the hollow glass eyes of unrepaired television sets, and realize that the man she loved had traded his life for a signal that never came. There was no justice, only futility. Elcio Correa Silva, the friend who had been the primary suspect, was eventually released. The police simply couldn't manufacture a motive or a method from thin air. Without a toxicology report and without the missing 2,300,000 cruzeros, the case collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility. The money that small fortune meant for a car and components was never recovered. It vanished as completely as the souls of the two men, leaving behind only the crude gray weight of the lead masks as a physical reminder of their descent into obsession. The aftermath of the lead masks case is a haunting lesson in the dangers of the strange, dark, and mysterious when it intersects with a fragile human mind. It reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't a person at all, but a conviction and idea so powerful that it can convince a rational technician to lie down in the mud and wait for a miracle that is actually a death sentence. To this day, the case remains one of Brazil's most enduring urban legends. A story whispered by those who look at the stars and wonder what price they would be willing to pay for a signal from the beyond. But as we leave the rain-slicked hills of Niterói behind, we find that not all mysteries are born from a search for the supernatural. Some are born from the cold, calculated desire to humiliate the powerful and to hold an entire nation hostage through the most innocent of things, a piece of candy. We travel across the globe now, from the humid tropics of South America to the neon-drenched high-tech urban sprawl of Osaka, Japan in the 1980s. Here, the predator doesn't wear a lead mask to hide from the light. He wears a mask to taunt the law. This is a story of a corporate kidnapping, a phantom organization, and a monster with 21 faces who proved that sometimes the most terrifying thing a criminal can do is not kill, but simply refuse to be caught. The evening of March 18, 1984, in the quiet, upscale suburb of Nishinomiya, Japan, felt like the very definition of security. Nishinomiya sits nestled between the vibrant, neon-lit chaos of Osaka and the sophisticated port city of Kobe. It is a place of manicured hedges, low stone walls, and the kind of profound silence that only wealth and social order can buy. In this neighborhood, the air in early spring carries a sharp, lingering bite of winter, mixed with the faint, floral promise of cherry blossoms that are just days away from blooming. Inside one particular home, a sprawling modern estate, the illusion of normalcy was as thick as the steam rising from the ofuro, the traditional Japanese soaking tub. This was the residence of 42-year-old Katsuhisa Izaki. To the outside world, Izaki was more than just a man. He was the living symbol of a national obsession. He was the president of Glico, one of the largest and most beloved confectionery companies in the world. If you have ever walked through the Dotonbori district in Osaka, you have seen the massive, glowing neon sign of the Glico running man crossing the finish line. That image represented health, success, and the sweet, simple joy of a caramel treat. Katsuhisa Izaki was a man who moved through life with the quiet, measured confidence of someone whose family had built an empire from sugar and grit. On this Sunday evening, he was engaging in the most sacred of Japanese domestic rituals, the evening bath. The bathroom was a sanctuary of cedar-scented wood and white tile. The water was hot, nearly scalding, designed to leach the tension of a high-stakes corporate week out of his muscles. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic splash of water and the distant, muffled voices of his wife and 3 children in the other wing of the house. To his neighbors, Izaki was the illusion of normalcy, personified a titan of industry who still took out the trash and bowed politely when he saw them on his morning jog. But while the neighborhood slept in its cocoon of safety, the predator's mask was already moving through the shadows of the garden. The perpetrators in this story did not look like the monsters of myth. If a neighbor had looked out their window, they might have seen 2 men dressed in dark, utilitarian clothing, the kind worn by late-night utility workers or security guards. They moved with a chilling, synchronized efficiency that suggested they weren't just criminals, but technicians of terror. Their mask was their anonymity. In a society built on trust and the assumption that everyone belongs in their place, these men were glitches in the system. They were ghosts who had bypassed the high stone walls and the heavy iron gates without making a sound. They didn't start with Katsuhisa. They started with the most vulnerable. They moved through the back of the house, entering the separate residence of Izaki's 70-year-old mother, Yoshie. In the silence of the night, the predator's mask slipped for just a moment as they bound and gagged the elderly woman with cold, professional speed. They didn't speak in shouts. They spoke in hushed, authoritative whispers that carried more weight than any scream. From there, they moved toward the main house. They encountered Izaki's wife Mikiko and their eldest daughter. The intruders didn't hesitate. They used heavy, industrial-grade tape and rough hemp rope, turning a home filled with the scent of expensive tea and laundry detergent into a cold, clinical prison. The mask the neighbors saw, the image of a quiet, respectable suburban street, was a lie. Behind the closed doors of the Izaki estate, the social contract of Japan was being torn to shreds. Katsuhisa Izaki, still submerged in the warm embrace of his bath, heard the door to the bathroom slide open. He likely expected his wife or one of his children. Instead, through the thick, white veil of steam, he saw two silhouettes. They were wearing dark caps and masks that obscured everything but their eyes. Eyes that held no malice, only a terrifying, businesslike detachment. One of the men held a pistol, its cold, oily scent cutting through the floral aroma of the bath salts. The other held a length of rope. In that split second, the illusion of normalcy evaporated. The president of a multi-billion-dollar candy empire, a man who provided sweetness to millions, was hauled naked and shivering from the water. He was not being treated as a person, but as a commodity. As they dragged him through his own home, past his bound and weeping family, the predator's mask was fully realized. These weren't just kidnappers. They were the harbingers of a psychological war that would soon bring the entire nation of Japan to its knees. The humid, aromatic steam of the ofuro still clung to Katsuhisa Izaki's skin when the sliding door of the bathroom didn't just open, it hissed with a clinical finality. 1 second, he was the king of a confectionery empire, submerged in the warm, liquid silence of his own success. The next, the cold, stagnant air of the hallway rushed in, carrying the scent of damp wool and gun oil. Through the swirling white mist, two silhouettes appeared, their features erased by dark caps and masks. This was the sudden incident, the precise millisecond where a life is bifurcated into before and after. There was no negotiation, there was no demand for a wallet or a watch. One of the intruders stepped forward, the floorboards of the expensive estate groaning under his weight, a heavy, rhythmic sound that felt like a heartbeat in the silence. He gripped Izaki by his wet, slippery shoulders. The initial chaos was not a loud, frantic scramble. It was a terrifyingly quiet, efficient extraction. Izaki, naked and shivering as the night air hit his damp body, was hauled from the tub. His bare feet slapped against the cold tile, a wet, rhythmic sound that echoed in the small room. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat as the metallic barrel of a pistol was pressed against the hollow of his neck. It was cold, impossibly cold, and smelled of cleaning solvent. The intruder didn't say a word. He simply nudged the barrel upward, a silent command that Izaki understood with primal clarity. They led him out of the bathroom and into the hallway, where the initial chaos had already claimed the rest of his family. As they moved through the house, Izaki saw his wife, Mikiko, and his daughter. They were on the floor, their hands bound tightly with rough, brown hemp rope that bit into their skin. Their mouths were sealed with heavy, industrial-grade tape, turning their cries into muffled, rhythmic whimpers that filled the hallway. The scent in the house had changed. It no longer smelled of home. It smelled of the outdoors, of wet pavement, and the exhaust of a waiting engine. The kidnappers didn't use a van with a sliding door in this instance. They had a small, inconspicuous car parked just beyond the shadows of the garden. They forced Izaki into the back seat, throwing a rough burlap sack over his head. The fabric was scratchy and smelled of ancient dust and dry grain, a jarring contrast to the silk and cedar of his daily life. The car door slammed shut with a metallic thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the neighborhood. The drive was short, perhaps 30 minutes, but for Izaki, trapped in the darkness of the sack, it felt like an eternity. He could feel the car turning, weaving through the quiet streets of the suburbs, and then accelerating onto a highway. The sound of the tires on the asphalt was a high-pitched, hypnotic whine. He was being taken away from the light, away from the world of candy and smiles, and into a void. They arrived at a warehouse in Ibaraki, a cold, cavernous space that smelled of stagnant water and rusting iron. This was the initial chaos in its purest form, a total lack of information. Izaki was tied to a chair, the hemp rope abrasive against his bare skin. The burlap sack was removed, revealing a space illuminated by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb that cast long, distorted shadows against the corrugated metal walls. The kidnappers finally spoke. They didn't ask for 1,000,000 yen. They didn't ask for 10 million. They handed Izaki a handwritten note and a tape recorder. They wanted 1 billion yen in cash and 100 kilograms of gold bullion. It was a ransom so massive, so audacious, that it felt less like a crime and more like a declaration of war against the very concept of the Japanese economy. Back at the Azaki estate, the initial chaos had transitioned into a frantic, high-stakes investigation. Mikiko had managed to free herself and call the police. Within the hour, the quiet streets of Nishinomiya were flooded with patrol cars, their red lights splashing against the stone walls of the mansions like blood. Detectives in gray suits moved through the garden with flashlights, their beams cutting through the dark like searching eyes. They found the discarded hemp rope. They found the tracks of the getaway car in the damp soil, but they found no sign of the predator. The news of the kidnapping hit the Japanese public like a physical blow. Glico wasn't just a company, it was a cultural pillar. To kidnap the Glico man was to kidnap the childhood of a nation. As the sun began to rise over Osaka on March 19, 1984, the air was thick, with a tension that hadn't been felt since the end of the war. The initial chaos had moved from a single bathroom to the entire country. Every phone call to the Glico headquarters was treated with suspicion. Every white van was stopped and searched. But while the police were setting up roadblocks and scouring the docks, the kidnappers were already playing a different game. They weren't just hiding, they were preparing to step into the light. They were about to give themselves a name that would haunt the dreams of every parent in Japan for the next 17 months. They were the monster with 21 faces, and they were just getting started. The sudden incident of the kidnapping was merely the first move in a grand psychological theater that would defy every rule of the strange, dark, and mysterious. To look into the dark side of the entity that called itself the monster with 21 faces is to stare into a void of calculated, theatrical arrogance. While the police were scouring the physical world, searching the muddy banks of the Inagawa River, and checking the registries of every rental warehouse in the Ibaraki prefecture, the predator was operating in a psychological secret basement that no search warrant could reach. Imagine a cramped, dimly lit apartment somewhere in the gray, industrial heart of Osaka. The air inside is stagnant, smelling of stale tobacco, cold coffee, and the sharp chemical tang of typewriter ribbon ink. This was their laboratory. On a low wooden table sat a heavy, black mechanical typewriter. Its keys didn't just tap, they struck the paper with a rhythmic, aggressive clack, clack, clack that sounded like a firing pin hitting a primer. The meticulous preparation of this group was not found in soundproofed walls or hidden cages, but in their mastery of information. In the corner of this room, a high-end radio scanner hissed with static. It was tuned specifically to the encrypted frequencies used by the Osaka Prefectural Police. The predator didn't just hide from the law, they invited the law into their living room, listening to the frantic, confused voices of detectives as they chased ghosts across the city. They knew exactly where the roadblocks were being set up, they knew which witnesses were being interrogated. They were essentially playing a game of chess where they could see the other player's hand through a two-way mirror. The psychology of the monster was rooted in a deep-seated desire to humiliate the very foundations of Japanese society. In Japan, reputation is everything. To lose face is a fate worse than death. By naming themselves after a famous fictional villain, the Fiend with 20 Faces, created by mystery writer Edogawa Rampo, they were casting themselves as the protagonists of a grand, dark play. But they added one more face. They were the monster with 21 faces, signaling that they were always one step ahead, one face more complex than anything the authorities could imagine. Their secret basement extended to the thousands of grocery stores and convenience shops across the country. They had spent months studying the distribution routes of the Glico company. They knew exactly how a box of almond chocolate traveled from the factory floor to the shelf of a neighborhood mom-and-pop shop. This wasn't just a kidnapping of a man, it was a kidnapping of a nation's sense of safety. Inside their hideout, they would sit and compose letters to the media and the police. These weren't ransom notes written in frantic, shaky handwriting. They were taunts, written with a playful, almost fatherly condescension. To the police, "Why don't you guys know? You look so lost. Let us help you," the typewriter would bark out. They used the media as a megaphone, sending letters to the Mainichi Shimbun and other major newspapers. They knew that in the high-pressure, honor-bound culture of Japan, the police would be driven to the brink of madness by public ridicule. Every letter was a psychological blow designed to fracture the confidence of the investigators. They were soundproofing their crimes by creating such a loud, chaotic noise in the public sphere that the quiet, diligent work of forensics was drowned out. The dark side of their preparation also involved a chilling disregard for the innocent. While they claimed they didn't want to hurt anyone, they were experimenting with a poisoning system that was terrifyingly simple. In their hideout, they didn't have vats of acid, they had small vials of potassium cyanide. They practiced opening consumer-grade packaging, the delicate plastic wrap of a Pocky box, or the foil seal of a chocolate bar, with such precision that it was impossible to tell the product had been tampered with. They were preparing to turn the nation's favorite snacks into hidden Claymore mines. There was a cold, intellectual joy in their preparation. They watched the news and laughed at the sight of thousands of police officers in white gloves bowing in apology to the public for their failure to catch the monster. The predator's mask was not just a physical piece of cloth. It was the 21 faces of their anonymity. They could be the delivery driver, the salaryman on the train, or the grandmother buying milk. By blending into the gray, hard-working masses of Japan, they made everyone a suspect, and no one a suspect. As the sun set over the neon skyline of Osaka, the monster sat in the dark, the blue light of the radio scanner reflecting off their eyes. They weren't just criminals, they were directors of a national nightmare. They had built a system where the meticulous preparation was the chaos itself. They had turned the entire country into their secret basement, and every time a child reached for a piece of candy, they were reaching into the dark side of a predator who found the terror of a nation to be the sweetest treat of all. The 3-day disappearance of Katsuhisa Izaki ended not with a daring police raid or a dramatic shootout, but with a cold, shivering man stumbling out of a warehouse into the pale gray light of an Osaka morning. On March 21, 1984, Izaki had managed to loosen his bonds, a feat of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation, and slipped through a gap in the warehouse's corrugated steel siding. He ran until his lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, eventually finding a railway worker who called the authorities. But if the Osaka Prefectural Police thought the return of the Glico president meant the nightmare was over, they were tragically, catastrophically mistaken. This was merely the moment the police deadlock hardened into a permanent, icy reality. In the weeks that followed, the investigation became a sprawling, multi-prefectural machine that consumed over 40,000 police officers. The air in the headquarters of the Osaka police was a stagnant, heavy fog of stale green tea, cheap cigarettes, and the metallic electric hum of hundreds of telephones. Detectives in wrinkled suits sat hunched over desks piled high with maps, surveillance photos, and transcripts of intercepted radio calls. They were looking for a group of men, but they were fighting a ghost. The deadlock was fueled by a series of minor errors that, in the high-stakes environment of Japanese law enforcement, felt like mortal wounds to the national honor. The most haunting of these occurred on a rain-slicked evening in late June 1984. The monster with 21 faces had demanded a ransom of 50 million yen to be dropped from a moving train headed toward Kyoto. A detective, dressed in civilian clothes and blending into the sea of tired salarymen, stood on the platform of the station. As the train roared to a halt, the air filled with the scent of hot metal and ozone. Through the scratched yellowish glass of a train window, the detective saw him, the fox-eyed man. He was a tall, lean individual with narrow, upturned eyes that seemed to hold a predatory, calculating stillness. He was wearing a dark windbreaker and carrying a large, heavy bag. This was the turning point that should have ended the case. The detective followed the man onto the train, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched the fox-eyed man as he sat near a window, his gaze fixed on the dark, blurring landscape of the Japanese countryside. The detective reached for his radio, his fingers trembling slightly. But here, the minor error of protocol took hold. Because the orders from the higher-ups were to monitor and observe rather than engage, the detective stayed his hand. He watched as the man eventually exited the train at a crowded station and vanished into the neon-drenched labyrinth of the city. By the time the order to arrest was given, the fox-eyed man was a shadow once more. The social and psychological barrier of Japanese society became the predator's greatest ally. In a culture where the collective good is paramount, the monster began to target the most sacred of Japanese institutions, the safety of the children. They sent a letter to the press that chilled the blood of every parent in the country, to the moms of Japan. In 10 days, some of Glico's sweets will be mixed with potassium cyanide. The response was a wave of pure, unadulterated initial chaos. The social barrier of public trust was shattered. Thousands of grocery store workers, their hands encased in white gloves, spent their days meticulously scanning shelves, their eyes searching for the tiny, red and white warning labels the monster had promised to place on the poisoned boxes. The scent of chocolate and caramel, once the aroma of childhood joy, now carried the imagined bitter almond smell of death. The police were paralyzed by the sheer scale of the threat. They were forced to watch as Glico's stock plummeted, their factories fell silent, and hundreds of workers were laid off. The deadlock was not just a lack of suspects, it was a psychological siege. The monster continued to send letters, taunting the police for their minor errors and their inability to catch a fox-eyed man on a train. "Dear police officers," one letter read, the words typed with a mocking, rhythmic precision. "You shouldn't lie. All crimes begin with a lie. Don't you know that? In Japan, there are two things you can't hide: a cough and a crime." The psychological pressure culminated in a tragedy that served as the ultimate social barrier. Superintendent Shoji Yamamoto of the Shiga Prefectural Police, a man who had dedicated his entire life to the service of the law, felt the weight of the failure personally. In August of 1985, after the monster had eluded yet another trap, Yamamoto walked into his garden, doused himself in kerosene, and set himself on fire. The initial chaos of his death sent a shockwave through the nation. It was a social barrier made of shame and honor. In their final, most cruel letter, the monster actually offered a twisted eulogy for the man they had driven to suicide. They announced they would stop harassing the candy companies, stating that they were bored and that the death of Yamamoto was enough of a victory. They simply stopped. The police deadlock remained, but the predator had left the field of battle. There were no more letters, no more poisoned candies, no more sightings of the fox-eyed man. The investigators were left standing in the ruins of a 2-year-long war, staring at 28,000 tips that led to nothing and 66 separate crimes that would never be solved. The minor errors of a single train ride and the social barrier of a culture's own high expectations had combined to create a vacuum where justice could not exist. The monster with 21 faces had achieved the impossible. They had committed the perfect crime, not by being invisible, but by being so loud that the law became deaf to the truth. The escape of Katsuhisa Izaki was not a cinematic explosion of action. It was a slow, agonizing victory of human spirit over industrial rot. Inside the warehouse in Ibaraki, the air was a stagnant, freezing soup of dust and the metallic scent of rusting iron. Izaki had been bound to a wooden chair for 60 hours. The hemp rope had moved past being a mere restraint. It was now a part of his body, the rough fibers grinding into his wrists until the scent of raw skin and salt filled his immediate surroundings. The turning point arrived with a moment of negligence that seemed almost too convenient. The guards, the ghosts who spoke in hushed, mechanical tones, had fallen silent in the adjacent room. The rhythmic, low hum of a distant truck on the highway was the only sound. Izaki, driven by a primal resilience, began to rock. Each movement was a gamble against the silence. Creak, creak, creak. He felt a slight gap in the tension of the rope. Using a jagged edge of a broken floorboard he had located with his bare feet, he began to saw. The extreme tension of that hour was a physical weight. Every time the wind rattled the corrugated steel siding, his heart would hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. Finally, the metallic sound of the lock of his own fear snapped. The rope gave way. He didn't stand up. He collapsed into the grit and the dust. He crawled through a gap in the warehouse wall, a loose sheet of metal that groaned as he pushed through it, and stepped into the biting cold of the Japanese night. He was free, but he was a man who had seen the dark side of his own empire. However, the discovery that truly paralyzed Japan occurred months later, in October of 1984. It was a random fluke that began in a small, brightly lit convenience store in South Osaka. A young clerk, moving through the rhythmic motions of restocking, noticed something wrong with a box of Morinaga Choco Balls. Taped to the side was a crudely printed label, "Danger contains poison. You will die if you eat this." The monster with 21 faces. This was the turning point for the entire nation. The predator had left a gap, they had tipped their hand. Testing revealed the candy was laced with lethal doses of potassium cyanide. The discovery triggered a belated intervention of unprecedented scale. Police searched thousands of stores, finding dozens of these poisoned gifts. Then came the random fluke of the video man. Investigators, scouring thousands of hours of grainy black and white security footage, found a ghost. There, on a flickering monitor, was a man in a baseball cap, his face obscured by the low resolution of the era. He was seen calmly placing a box of candy on a shelf and walking away. This was a digital photo from a pre-digital age, a fleeting glimpse of a predator who moved with the confidence of a man who knew he was invisible. The fox-eyed man remained the most haunting random fluke of all. A sketch was released to the public, a face with sharp, upturned eyes and a thin, cruel mouth. It became the bite mark of the investigation, a visual scar that every citizen in Japan memorized. There were reports of sightings in Kyoto, in Tokyo, in the crowded stations of the Shinkansen. But every time the belated intervention of the law reached out to grab him, he dissolved like mist. Even as the decades passed and DNA testing became a reality, the negligence of the early investigation, the failure to secure the ransom drop sites, the minor errors in surveillance meant there was no biological trail to follow. The monster had been too careful, or perhaps the social barrier of their anonymity was simply too thick to pierce. The turning point had come and gone, leaving a nation to wonder how a group of men could hold a knife to the throat of a country's childhood and then simply walk away into the neon-lit shadows of history. The final letter from the Monster with 21 Faces arrived in the offices of the Japanese media in the summer of 1985, not with a bang, but with a chilling, arrogant whisper. The rhythmic, aggressive clack of the typewriter had finally fallen silent. The predator had decided the game was over. They stated they were bored with the chase, and that the tragic suicide of Superintendent Yamamoto was a sufficient tribute to their power. And then, as if they had never existed, they vanished. The aftermath of the Glico Morinaga case is a landscape defined by the heavy, suffocating weight of futility. For the thousands of detectives who had spent 17 months breathing in the scent of stale coffee and industrial ink, the end was not a victory. There were no handshakes, no medals, and no closure. Instead, there was only the metallic sound of locks clicking shut on thousands of evidence lockers, sealing away secrets that the world was never meant to know. In February of the year 2000, the statute of limitations for the kidnapping of Katsuhisa Izaki officially expired. At the stroke of midnight, the crime became a ghost that could no longer be prosecuted. 5 years later, in the year 2005, the statute of limitations for the attempted poisonings also reached its end. The monster had won. They had not only committed the perfect crime, they had outrun the very concept of time. Today, the Glico Running Man still glows with a vibrant neon intensity over the Dotonbori Canal in Osaka. He is a symbol of health and success, a bright blue and yellow beacon in the night. But for those who lived through the 1980s, that sweetness will always have a faint, lingering aftertaste of potassium cyanide. The fox-eyed man remains a sketch on a yellowing piece of paper in the back of a cold case file, his narrow, upturned eyes staring out at a world that has moved on, yet remains haunted by his gaze. The justice in this story is non-existent. There were no life sentences, no dramatic confessions, only a profound national sense of vulnerability. Japan learned that even in a society built on the highest levels of trust and order, a monster can emerge from the shadows, hold the nation's childhood hostage, and then melt back into the crowd of 40 million people without leaving a single fingerprint. The case remains a monument to the strange, dark, and mysterious in an urban setting. A reminder that the most dangerous predator is often the one you pass every day on the train, the one whose face is just one of 21 others. But as we leave the neon-drenched streets of Osaka and the high-tech corporate wars of the 80s behind, we find that the most terrifying mysteries don't always require a typewriter or a national media stage. Sometimes, the dark side is much more intimate. It doesn't hide in a city of millions, it hides in the absolute crushing silence of a lonely farmstead. We travel now back in time and across the globe to the year 1922 to a remote corner of Bavaria, Germany. Here, the air doesn't smell of city exhaust or candy, it smells of damp earth, livestock, and the sharp metallic scent of a cold wind blowing off the forest. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck, a place where the illusion of normalcy was not shattered by a letter or a phone call, but by a set of footprints in the snow that led toward the house, but never led back out. The landscape of Upper Bavaria in late March 1922 was a study in monochromatic desolation. Located roughly 60 kilometers north of Munich, the area surrounding the small town of Kaifeck was a patchwork of dense, ancient woodlands and flat, unforgiving farmland that seemed to hold on to the winter frost with a stubborn, icy grip. The air was perpetually damp, carrying the heavy, cloying scent of wet pine needles, thawing manure, and the metallic tang of a coming sleet storm. In the center of this isolation sat a farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. The name itself, meaning behind Kaifek, suggested a place tucked away from the eyes of God and man, a hidden corner where the rules of the civilized world felt thin and negotiable. The illusion of normalcy at Hinterkaifeck was built on a foundation of grueling, rhythmic labor. The farm was a sprawling, star-shaped complex where the living quarters and the barn were connected by a series of heavy wooden doors and cold stone passageways. Inside, the air was a thick, suffocating mix of wood smoke and the animal heat of the cattle lowing in the stalls. This was the world of the Gruber family. 70-year-old Andreas, his 72-year-old wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's two children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph. To the outside world, the Grubers were a source of dark fascination and hushed whispers in the local taverns. Andreas was a man carved out of old, gnarled oak, bitter, reclusive, and notoriously mean-spirited. He was a man who moved with a slow, heavy gait, his hands permanently stained with the dirt of his fields and the grease of his tools. His neighbors saw him not as a friend, but as a predator of a different sort, a man rumored to have an incestuous and abusive relationship with his own daughter, Victoria. They saw the family through a mask of grim respectability, but they knew that behind the stone walls of Hinterkaifeck, there was a profound and unsettling silence. The routine of the farm was absolute. Every morning, before the sun had even thought about cresting the horizon, the heavy, rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood would echo through the valley. The metallic sound of locks clicking open as the family moved between the house and the barn was the only heartbeat the farm possessed. Victoria, a woman with a hauntingly beautiful voice, would often be heard singing in the local church choir. But back at the farm, she was a shadow, moving through the chores with a robotic, joyless efficiency. However, in the days leading up to late March, the predator's mask began to manifest in ways that defied the logic of a simple farm life. It started with the previous maid, who had fled the property 6 months earlier in a state of pure, unadulterated terror. She claimed that the house was haunted, that she heard footsteps in the attic when no one was there, and that she felt an unblinking pair of eyes watching her from the shadows of the barn. Andreas had dismissed her as a hysterical woman, but as the spring thaw began, even he could no longer ignore the anomalies. A few days before the end of the month, Andreas stood at the edge of his property, his breath hitching in the cold air. The ground was covered in a fresh, thin layer of powder blue snow. There, leading from the dark, impenetrable edge of the forest directly toward the back door of the machine shed, was a set of footprints. They were deep, clear, and made by a man's heavy boots. Andreas followed the tracks with his eyes, his heart rate beginning to climb. He walked to the door, checking the lock. It was untouched. But then, he looked back toward the woods. The footprints only went one way. They led to the house, but there were no tracks leading back away. He spent the rest of the day pacing the perimeter of the farm, his eyes scanning the tree line. He found a strange newspaper on the porch, a Munich Gazette that no one in the family had subscribed to. He found a set of scratches on the lock of the tool shed, as if someone had been trying to pick it with a steady, practiced hand. That night, as the family sat around the wooden table for their evening meal, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of a house holding its breath. Above them, in the crawl space of the attic, the floorboards groaned. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, the sound of someone shifting their weight. Andreas climbed the ladder, a flickering candle in his hand, but he found nothing but dust and the cold, stagnant air of the rafters. He didn't know that the predator wasn't a ghost. He didn't know that the mask was someone who had already made themselves a permanent, invisible resident of his home. In the eyes of the neighbors, the Grubers were simply a cold, unlikable family living out their days in isolation. They saw the smoke rising from the chimney and assumed the illusion of normalcy was intact. They didn't see the footprints. They didn't hear the footsteps in the attic. And they didn't see the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arriving at the farm on the afternoon of March 31st, the 1922, carrying her suitcase into a house where the predator had already finished its meticulous preparation and was simply waiting for the sun to go down. The sun finally surrendered to the horizon on the evening of March 31st, 1922, leaving Hinterkaifeck draped in a bruised violet twilight. The wind, which had been a persistent whistle all afternoon, began to howl with a newfound predatory intensity, rattling the loose shingles of the barn and sending icy drafts through the chinks in the stone walls. Inside the farmhouse, the initial chaos began not with a scream, but with a series of small, mundane disruptions that felt like frayed threads in a tapestry. It started with the livestock. In the barn, the cattle began to low a deep, discordant sound that vibrated through the floorboards of the living quarters. It wasn't the usual rhythmic grumble of hungry animals, it was a frantic, chest-heavy baying. Cecilia, the 72-year-old matriarch, stood by the heavy oak table, her hands still dusted with flour from the evening meal. She wiped them on her apron, the fabric dry and coarse. She looked toward the heavy wooden door that led to the stable corridor. "Something is bothering the cows," she likely whispered, her voice barely audible over the groaning of the timber. She lit a small handheld lantern. The flame flickered, casting a dancing, distorted shadow against the wall, a shadow that looked like a long, thin limb reaching for the ceiling. She stepped through the door into the unheated passage. The temperature dropped instantly, the air smelling of cold stone, old hay, and the sharp ammonia scent of the stables. She walked toward the barn, the metallic sound of the lock echoing as she pushed open the final heavy door. The sudden incident occurred in the absolute, suffocating darkness of the hayloft entrance. As Cecilia stepped onto the threshing floor, her lantern illuminating only a small circle of dust-filled air, she didn't see the figure standing in the rafters. She didn't see the gleam of the mattock, a heavy two-handed tool with a pick on one side and an adze on the other. There was no warning. There was only the rhythmic, rushing sound of a heavy object cutting through the air. The strike was precise, a single, muffled thud that was instantly swallowed by the lowing of the cattle and the roar of the wind outside. Cecilia collapsed into the hay, the lantern shattering and spilling a small, dying pool of oil onto the floor. The initial chaos was a silent one. No one in the house heard the impact. No one heard the heavy breathing of the person standing over her. Back in the kitchen, Andreas grew impatient. His wife hadn't returned. He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He didn't call out. He was a man of few words and even less patience. He followed the same path, his heavy boots thumping against the stone. He entered the barn, perhaps squinting into the gloom, looking for the glow of his wife's lantern. He stepped over the threshold, and the mattock fell again. 1, 2. The sequence was being repeated with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. Then came Victoria. Then came 7-year-old Cecilia. One by one, they were drawn into the barn by the silence of the ones who went before them. It was a sudden incident played out in 4 acts, a systematic clearing of the family tree in the dark, cold heart of the farm. The girl, young Cecilia, in her final moments of terror, reached up and tore out tufts of her own hair, a silent, visceral reaction to a horror her mind couldn't process. The initial chaos finally moved from the barn to the house. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid who had arrived only hours earlier, was in her small bedroom adjacent to the kitchen. She had likely heard nothing but the wind. She was perhaps unpacking her few belongings, the scent of lavender from her satchel mingling with the smell of the wood stove. The door to her room didn't burst open. It slid open with a slow, deliberate creak. She turned, her eyes wide, and in that split second, the predator ended her journey before it had truly begun. Finally, the intruder moved toward the nursery. 2-year-old Joseph was asleep in his crib, a small wooden basket draped with heavy wool blankets. The sudden incident there was the most silent of all. When it was over, the initial chaos had reached its conclusion. 6 people were dead. The cattle continued to low, their voices growing hoarse. The wind continued to batter the walls of Hinterkaifeck. But inside, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the long case clock in the hallway and the heavy, steady footsteps of a man who was not a member of the family, yet who was now the only living soul left in the house. To understand the dark side of the predator who haunted the halls of Hinterkaifeck, one must first understand the architecture of isolation. In 1922, a Bavarian farmstead was not merely a collection of buildings. It was a fortress of survival, designed to keep the world out and the heat in. But for the Gruber family, the very walls meant to protect them had been transformed into a secret basement that existed not beneath their feet, but directly above their heads. The meticulous preparation for this crime did not begin with the first swing of the mattock. It began weeks, perhaps even months, earlier. Imagine the attic of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse, a vast, cavernous void filled with the dry, choking dust of decades-old hay and the skeletal remains of forgotten farm equipment. The air up there was stagnant, tasting of cold lime and the sharp, acidic scent of mice. It was a space of soundproofing provided by the thick, thatched roof and the heavy timber floorboards. In the weeks leading up to the end of March, the predator had moved into this space. He didn't just hide, he established a residence. He had created a nest in the deepest corner of the hayloft. a hollowed-out burrow where he could lie perfectly still for hours, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air. From this vantage point, he possessed the predator's mask of invisibility. He wasn't a stranger passing through. He was a phantom roommate who knew every rhythmic creak of the floorboards and every habit of the inhabitants below. The psychology of such a person is a labyrinth of voyeuristic obsession and cold, calculated patience. This wasn't a crime of passion or a sudden burst of rage. It was a meticulous study. Through small gaps in the attic floor, knotholes in the wood that had been widened with a pocket knife, the predator watched. He watched Victoria as she brushed her hair by the light of a single candle. He watched Andreas as he counted his money at the kitchen table, the light reflecting off the old man's bitter, suspicious eyes. He watched the children play, their laughter rising through the floorboards like a taunt. This soundproof system allowed the killer to hear the most intimate details of their lives. He knew when they slept, he knew when the doors were bolted. He knew which dog barked at the wind and which one could be silenced with a scrap of dried meat. The preparation involved more than just watching, it involved psychological warfare. He was the one who left the Munich newspaper on the porch a message to Andreas that the world outside was closer than he thought. He was the one who had scratched at the locks, testing the metallic sound of the tumblers, not to break in, but to see how long it would take for Andreas to notice. The dark side of this predator was most evident in his choice of weapon. He didn't bring a pistol or a polished blade, he chose a mattock, a heavy, industrial-grade tool of the earth. By using a tool that belonged to the farm, he was signaling a terrifying kind of intimacy. He wasn't just killing the Grubers, he was using their own life's work to unmake them. The weight of the tool, its rough wooden handle, and the cold iron pick represented a meticulous understanding of the physical labor that defined Hinterkaifeck. But the most chilling aspect of the predator's psychology was revealed after the initial chaos had subsided. Most killers flee the scene, driven by the frantic lizard-brain urge to put distance between themselves and the blood. But the monster of Hinterkaifeck did the opposite. He stayed. For 3 full days after the family had been laid out in the barn, the predator lived in the house. This was the ultimate realization of his secret basement fantasy. He stepped out of the shadows and into the warmth of the kitchen. He used the wood stove to cook meals, using the family's own stores of bacon and flour. The scent of frying fat and fresh bread filled the house, mingling with the copper-sweet smell of the blood cooling in the barn just a few meters away. He was seen by neighbors during this time, or at least the evidence of his presence was seen. Smoke continued to drift lazily from the chimney into the gray Bavarian sky. The cattle, which would have died of thirst within 48 hours, were found, fed, and watered. The predator had assumed the role of the master of the house. He moved through the rooms with a proprietary ease, perhaps even sleeping in the very beds where his victims had once dreamed. The dark side here is a total lack of empathy, replaced by a terrifying domestic psychopathy. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a squatter in the afterlife of a family he had destroyed. He lived in the soundproofed silence of a dead farm, listening to the wind howl against the stone walls, feeling the rhythmic heartbeat of a house that now belonged entirely to him. He had stripped away the illusion of normalcy and replaced it with a reality so dark that it defied the comprehension of the villagers in Kaifek. He was a man who found comfort in a tomb, a technician of death who viewed the Hinterkaifeck farmstead not as a crime scene, but as a hard-earned prize. The morning of Saturday, April 1st, 1922, arrived with a deceptive, crystal-clear stillness. In the nearby village of Kaifek, life followed its predictable, pious rhythm. The church bells pealed across the valley, a rhythmic bronze summons to the weekend's preparations. But at Hinterkaifeck, the police deadlock was already beginning to form, not through a lack of action, but through a terrifying, high-stakes silence. For 4 days, the farm existed in a state of gruesome animation. To the casual observer, the postman who left the newspapers, the neighbors who glanced toward the ridge from their own fields, everything appeared normal. Smoke, thin and gray, continued to spiral from the chimney, a silent signal of a hearth still burning. The windows, though dark, didn't suggest a tragedy. They suggested the privacy of a family that had always preferred its own company. But the minor errors of perception were beginning to accumulate. On Saturday, the postman, Josef Mayer, trudged up the long, muddy path to the farm. He noticed the newspapers from the previous 2 days were still tucked into the door handle, their edges fluttering in the wind like the wings of a trapped bird. He knocked the sound flat and hollow against the heavy oak. There was no answer. He assumed the family was in the fields or the barn, and he left. unaware that he was standing only a few meters away from a mass grave. On Sunday, the social and psychological barrier of the community's disdain for Andreas Gruber played its part in the delay. The family failed to appear for Sunday Mass, a grave social sin in the deeply religious heart of Bavaria. Victoria, the woman with the voice of an angel, was absent from the choir loft. People whispered in the pews. They traded looks of disapproval, but no one went to check on them. The Grubers were strange. They were dark. The rumors of incest and Andreas's violent temper acted as a physical wall, keeping the concerned citizens of Kaifek at a safe, judgmental distance. They assumed the family was simply having another one of their internal disputes and chose to look the other way. By Monday, the initial chaos of the town's growing suspicion reached a breaking point. 7-year-old Cecilia had missed school for 2 days. The mechanic, Albert Hoffner, arrived at the farm to repair a stationary engine. He spent 5 hours on the property, working in the rhythmic, metallic silence of the machine shed. He saw no one. He heard nothing but the lowing of the cows and the occasional restless pacing of the family dog, which was tied up in the barn. When he finished, he walked to the house to collect his payment. He knocked, he shouted, silence. He left, later telling the villagers that the farm felt empty, yet somehow occupied. Finally, on Tuesday, April 4th, the deadlock was broken by a search party led by Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had a complicated, bitter history with the Gruber family. As they approached the farm, the air felt stagnant, heavy, with a scent that was no longer just manure and wet earth. It was a sweet, cloying aroma that seemed to hang in the shadows of the eaves. They entered the barn first. The metallic sound of the lock was absent, the door was unbolted. They pushed it open, the hinges screaming in the silence. And there, under a layer of blood-soaked hay and a discarded wooden door, they found them. The 4 bodies were stacked with a chilling, geometric precision. The police deadlock intensified the moment the authorities from Munich arrived. Lead investigator Georg Reingruber stepped onto the property and was immediately met with a crime scene that had been destroyed by minor errors. Before the police had even arrived, dozens of curious villagers had swarmed the farm. They had trampled the one-way footprints in the snow. They had touched the bodies, moving them to check for pulses that had long since ceased to beat. Most horrifyingly, the search party had entered the kitchen and eaten a meal of bread and cold meat, unaware that the killer had likely sat in those very chairs only hours before. The investigation was a masterclass in futility. The police conducted over 100 autopsies, not on bodies, but on suspects. They questioned vagrants, former farmhands, and even Lorenz Schlittenbauer himself, whose meticulous knowledge of the farm's layout made him a prime suspect. But they found no bite mark, no physical evidence to link anyone to the Matic. The social barrier of the family's reputation continued to haunt the case. The police theorized that the motive was robbery, but when they searched the house, they found thousands of gold marks hidden in plain sight. The killer hadn't taken the money. This wasn't a crime of greed, it was a crime of darkness. The most devastating minor error occurred during the autopsies, which were performed on the family's own kitchen table. The coroner discovered that young Cecilia had not died instantly. She had survived for several hours, lying in the dark of the barn, clutching the hair she had torn from her own head in a state of total psychological collapse. As the weeks turned into months, the Munich police found themselves staring into a void. They had hundreds of files, thousands of testimonies, and a pile of evidence that pointed in every direction and nowhere all at once. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck had become a permanent deadlock. The community's silence, the contamination of the scene, and the sheer, inexplicable nature of a killer who stayed to feed the cattle created a mystery that was soundproofed against the truth. The farm stood as a monument to a failure of justice, its windows staring out at the Bavarian woods like the eyes of a witness who had been rendered permanently mute. The discovery of the horror at Hinterkaifeck did not happen with a scream. It happened with a slow, agonizing realization that the silence of the farm was not empty, it was occupied. By Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, the extreme tension in the village of Kaifek had become a physical weight. 3 men, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Michael Pohl, and Jakob Sigel, marched toward the farmstead, their boots crunching rhythmically on the thawing, muddy earth. The air was unnervingly still, save for the frantic, hoarse barking of the family's Spitz dog, which was tied up near the barn entrance, its eyes wide and rolling with a primal terror. As they reached the barn, the turning point arrived. Schlittenbauer, driven by a desperate, nervous energy, pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was a cavern of shadows, smelling of ancient dust and a new, cloying sweetness that made the men's stomachs churn. They began to move through the hay, their hands trembling. In the corner, near the door to the stable, they saw a large, flat wooden board, actually a door that had been ripped from its hinges, lying over a pile of straw. Schlittenbauer reached down and heaved the board aside. The discovery was so sudden and so geometric in its brutality that the men froze. There, stacked like cordwood, were 4 bodies. The negligence of the predator was revealed in the way he had tried to hide them, not by burying them, but by simply covering them with the debris of their own lives. They saw the gray hair of Andreas, the floral apron of Kazelia, and the small, pale hand of 7-year-old Kazelia. The extreme tension shifted from the barn to the house. The men, now joined by others, moved toward the living quarters. They expected to find the house ransacked, but instead they found a random fluke of domesticity that was far more terrifying. The house was warm. The wood stove in the kitchen was still radiating heat, its iron surface warm to the touch. On the table sat the remains of a meal, bread, and meat that had been eaten recently. This was the predator's gap. He had not fled into the night after the murders on Friday. He had stayed. For 3, perhaps 4 days, he had lived among the dead. The negligence was his arrogance, the belief that he could step into the shoes of the man he had murdered. The search party found that the cattle had been meticulously fed and watered. The random fluke of the mechanic, Albert Hoffner, who had worked on the farm for 5 hours while the family lay dead in the barn, became a chilling focal point. The killer had likely been watching him through the attic window the entire time, perhaps even enjoying the rhythmic sound of the mechanic's tools as he went about his dark, quiet life. The belated intervention of the Munich police was plagued by the lack of technology in 1922. However, they did attempt a random fluke of the era. They sent the skulls of the 6 victims to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants. The heads were removed from the bodies, a gruesome detail that only added to the futility of the case when the skulls were lost during the chaos of the Second World War. Decades later, in 2007, a modern belated intervention took place. Students at the Bavarian Police Academy took up the case as a final project. They used modern criminal profiling, high-resolution digital mapping of the original crime scene photos, and advanced forensic logic to re-examine the suspects. They found that every predator leaves a gap, and through their analysis, they narrowed the field down to a single, highly likely suspect. However, out of respect for the living descendants of that individual, they refused to release the name. The turning point of modern science had finally caught up to the 1922 nightmare, but the deadlock of history and social grace kept the final answer hidden. The discovery at Hinterkaifeck remains a story of a predator who didn't just strike and vanish, but who stayed to witness the futility of the world's response, leaving behind a farmstead that would eventually be torn down to the ground, its soil salted with the secrets of a man who watched from the attic and never let go. The demolition of Hinterkaifeck in 1923 was more than just a clearing of land. It was a desperate, physical attempt by the community to excise a cancer from the Bavarian countryside. As the heavy sledgehammers swung against the stone walls and the thatched roof was pulled down in a cloud of ancient choking dust, the metallic sound of locks was finally silenced. The villagers wanted the illusion of normalcy back. They wanted to look at that ridge and see a field of corn, not a monument to a predator who had outsmarted the world. But the aftermath of Hinterkaifeck is defined by a deep, hollow sense of futility. The investigation didn't just go cold, it disintegrated. The most haunting symbol of this failure is the fate of the victims' remains. After the autopsies on the kitchen table, the skulls of the 6 family members were severed and sent to Munich, where the police, in a move of pure desperation, handed them over to clairvoyants in hopes of a psychic breakthrough. Those skulls, the final physical evidence of the monster of Hinterkaifeck, were later lost or destroyed during the Allied bombings of World War II. The victims were robbed of their names, their lives, and eventually, their very bones. The social barrier of the village never truly fell. Lorenz Schlittenbauer lived out the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion, constantly suing neighbors for slander whenever they whispered his name in the local tavern. He died in 1941 without ever being charged, taking whatever secrets he possessed or didn't possess to his own grave. The case files grew yellow and brittle, filled with the minor errors of a pre-forensic era and the conflicting testimonies of people who were more interested in local grudges than the truth. Today, if you visit the site where Hinterkaifeck once stood, you will find nothing but a small, unassuming stone memorial in the middle of a quiet field. There are no one-way footprints in the dirt. and the rhythmic sound of the wind through the trees no longer carries the lowing of ghost cattle. Yet, the psychological predator's mask remains. The story survives because it taps into our most primal fear, the intrusion of the unknown into the sacred space of the home. The lesson of Hinterkaifeck and of all these stories is that the strange, dark, and mysterious does not always require a high-tech villain or a complex conspiracy. Sometimes, it is as simple as a man standing in an attic, watching through a knothole while a family eats dinner. It is the realization that the soundproofed system we build around our lives is thinner than we think. Whether it is the frozen silence of the Plumas National Forest, the lead masks of a Brazilian hill, the taunting letters of a monster in Osaka, or the heavy mattock of a Bavarian farmstead, the predator thrives in the gaps. It hides in the things we refuse to see and the footsteps we choose to ignore. We tell these stories not just to remember the victims, but to remind ourselves that the illusion of normalcy is a fragile thing, and that sometimes the most terrifying footprints are the ones that lead toward us. And then simply stop. And now, as the last echoes of these stories fade into the background, we leave those dark corners behind. The monster with 21 faces has dissolved into the static of history. The one-way footprints at Hinterkaifeck have long since washed away. Those cold, high-altitude roads and rain-slicked hills are thousands of miles from where you are right now. Take a deep, slow breath in and let it out. You are safe. You are in your own space, surrounded by the familiar and the known. Those mysteries were just journeys of the mind, and now that journey has reached its destination. As you lie there, I want you to feel the weight of your body pressing against your bed. Notice how the mattress supports you completely. Your shoulders are beginning to drop, releasing the tension of the day. Your legs feel heavy, sinking deeper and deeper into the softness beneath you. Breathe in slowly, and as you exhale, imagine the dark city streets and the jagged mountain peaks simply melting away. They are turning into a soft gray mist. In your mind, follow that mist. It isn't cold or frightening, it is a warm silver blanket that leads you into a place of absolute peace. You are standing at the edge of a vast, ancient forest at dawn. The air here is clean and smells of damp moss and cedar. There is no wind here, only a profound velvet silence. The ground beneath your feet is a soft carpet of pine needles. Every breath you take in this forest fills you with a sense of calm and stillness. There are no predators here. There are no puzzles to solve. There is only the gentle, rhythmic pulse of the earth. Feel your eyelids growing heavier now. The world is quiet. Your room is a sanctuary. The stories are over, and the only thing left is the rhythmic, steady flow of your own breath. You are grounded. You are protected. You are home. Sleep now. Drift into the mist. Good night, and sweet dreams.